Welcome to Whispering Willow's Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe will help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fog of London crept along the cobblestones of Soho like gentle fingers, caressing each stone and seeping into every crevice of the narrow streets. It was a peculiar sort of evening in the autumn of 1893, when the air carried both the lingering warmth of day and the first whispers of night's chill. Among the maze of alleyways and thoroughfares, a single gas lamp flickered outside a modest shop front, its glow struggling against the thickening mist. The brass plaque beside the door polished to a soft gleam despite years of London's sooty breath, read simply, Edward Tiller, Master Clockmaker. Within the shop's windows, dozens of timepieces caught what little light remained of the day, their faces glowing like miniature moons. Yet something unusual had drawn a small cluster of onlookers to pause before the display. Every clock, from the grandest long case to the most delicate pocket watch, showed precisely the same time, 17 minutes past 2. The hands stood frozen in their positions, as if time itself had stopped within the confines of Mr. Tiller's establishment. The soft murmur of conversation drifted through the evening air, mingling with the distant clatter of hooves and carriage wheels. The scent of coal smoke hung like a veil over everything, punctuated by hints of fresh bread from the nearby bakery that had not yet closed for the day. A constable stood at the shop's entrance, his breath visible in small clouds as he turned away the curious with polite but firm words. It was into this scene that a hansom cab arrived, its wheels hissing softly against the damp street. 2 gentlemen emerged, one tall and lean with the sharp, observant eyes of a hawk, the other shorter, with a military bearing despite his medical bag and concerned expression. The taller man paused, tilting his head slightly as if listening to a sound no one else could hear, before approaching the constable with purposeful strides. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," the constable nodded, stepping aside. "Inspector Lestrade is waiting inside, sir." Sherlock Holmes acknowledged the greeting with the barest inclination of his head, his gaze already moving past the man to study the shop's interior. "Come, Watson," he murmured, his voice low and measured, as they crossed the threshold into a world where time stood still. The interior of the clockmaker's shop felt oddly suspended between silence and sound. Though none of the clocks were functioning, the space seemed to hold the memory of their collective ticking, a phantom rhythm that both men could almost perceive in the quiet. The air smelled of polishing oil, fine wood, and something else. The metallic hint of blood, faint but unmistakable to those who knew its scent. Inspector Lestrade stood near the counter, his usually confident posture somewhat subdued in the strange atmosphere of the silent shop. Behind him, partially obscured by a large astronomical clock, lay the body of Edward Tiller. "This is a peculiar one, Holmes," Lestrade said softly, as if reluctant to disturb the unnatural quiet. "Edward Tiller, 56 years of age, master clockmaker for nearly 30 years. Found this morning by his apprentice, a young man named Thomas Merrick." Holmes removed his gloves slowly, his eyes already cataloguing the scene in meticulous detail. "And the time on the clocks?" he inquired, though he had already observed the synchronicity from outside. "All of them, Holmes," Lestrade confirmed, with a gesture that encompassed the entire shop. "Every blessed timepiece in this establishment, exactly 17 minutes past 2. The apprentice swears they were all functioning normally when he left yesterday evening." Dr. Watson moved carefully toward the body, crouching to conduct his preliminary examination, while Holmes circled the shop with deliberate steps. The floorboards whispered beneath his feet, old wood that had borne the weight of countless customers seeking to measure their days with precision. The clockmaker lay on his back, arms outstretched in a manner that eerily resembled the hands of a clock at the very time displayed on his creations. His waistcoat, once a rich burgundy, now bore a dark stain that spread from a single wound to his chest. His spectacles remained perfectly positioned on his nose, reflecting the gaslight in twin crescents of gold. "Single stab, wound to the heart," Watson murmured, his clinical tone softened by respect. "Clean and precise. Death would have been almost immediate." He glanced up at Holmes, who was now examining a delicate pocket watch with a magnifying glass. "Rigor suggests he died between 8 and 12 hours ago, perhaps midnight to 4 this morning." Holmes nodded absently, his focus unwavering from the timepiece in his hand. "Curious?" he remarked, more to himself than his companions. "Most curious indeed." The shop itself was a testament to orderliness. Tools were arranged with meticulous care on the workbench, each implemented precisely positioned, as if part of a complex mechanism itself. Drawers labelled in a neat hand contained springs, gears, and cogs of various sizes. Ledgers stacked with mathematical precision held records of sales, repairs, and appointments. Only a single chair, overturned near where the body lay, suggested any disturbance to this regimented world. Holmes moved to the workbench, his fingers hovering over the tools without touching them. "Our clockmaker was left-handed," he observed, noting the arrangement that favoured a southpaw's grip. "Particularly about his work environment. Not a wealthy man, but respected in his field, the quality of his clientele evidenced by these commissions." He gestured to several half-finished pieces beneath glass domes, their inner workings exposed like anatomical studies. The soft glow of the gas lamps cast long shadows across the wooden floor, creating pools of warm light around which darkness gathered like hesitant visitors. Outside, the rumble of London continued its muted percussion, the distant bells of St. Anne's marking the quarter hour, the occasional call of a street vendor closing his stall, the clop of hooves passing by in rhythmic patterns. Lestrade cleared his throat, the sound startling in the shop's stillness. "There's something else, Holmes. The safe behind the counter, untouched. £87 inside, along with several valuable watches left for repair. Nothing appears to have been taken." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed this information. He completed his circuit of the shop, returning to stand before the body of Edward Tiller. For a long moment he simply observed, his gaze taking in every detail of the man who had devoted his life to measuring time, only to have his own cut short. "The apprentice, Lestrade. Where might we find him?" "At his lodgings, I expect. Young Merrick has rooms above the bakery 2 streets over. We've already questioned him, but you would benefit from my assessment," Holmes finished for him, his tone neither boastful nor apologetic. merely stating a fact as plainly as he would the time of day. Watson and I shall call upon him shortly. First, however, I would like to understand more about our clockmaker's final hours. With careful movements, Holmes knelt beside the body, his keen eyes noting the man's worn but well-kept hands, the hands of a craftsman who had maintained his skill despite advancing years. The clockmaker's fingers were stained with the telltale marks of his trade, small calluses where fine tools had rested over decades, a faint bluish tint from working with certain metals, the nearly invisible scars of minor injuries long healed. "He had an appointment last evening," Holmes remarked, indicating a small notebook that protruded slightly from Tiller's waistcoat pocket. "His last client, perhaps." With Lestrade's nod of permission, Holmes gently extracted the notebook, its leather cover soft and supple from years of use. The pages whispered against each other as he turned them with delicate precision, revealing entries in the same neat hand that labelled the drawers. His finger traced down to the final notation. "PM, 8:30, Special Commission." Watson leaned closer, his shoulder nearly touching Holmes's, as they both studied the cryptic entry. "No name," the doctor observed, "unusual for a man so meticulous." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, closing the notebook and returning it to the clockmaker's pocket. Our Mr. Tiller knew his final visitor well enough to dispense with formalities, or... His eyes brightened with that familiar spark of intrigue. Or he wished to maintain discretion regarding their identity. The detective rose to his feet in a fluid motion, turning his attention once more to the clocks that surrounded them. Each face stared back, unanimously declaring that moment 17 minutes past 2, with unwavering conviction. "Tell me, Lestrade, was anything found in the clockmaker's hands? Any object he might have been holding when he died?" The inspector shook his head. "Nothing, Holmes. His hands were empty, just as you see them." Holmes hummed softly, a note of contemplation in the sound. "And no sign of forced entry. The lock is uncompromised." "None whatsoever. By all appearances, he admitted his killer willingly." The gas lamps flickered momentarily as a draught found its way through some unseen gap, causing the shadows to dance across the walls like figures in a macabre ballet. The temperature seemed to drop a fraction, though perhaps it was merely the effect of standing in a room where death had so recently visited. Watson shivered slightly, drawing his coat closer. "What significance do you attribute to the clocks, Holmes? Why stop them all at precisely the same time?" Holmes's gaze swept across the frozen timepieces, his expression thoughtful. "Time, my dear Watson, is the one constant we all share, yet experience uniquely. For a clockmaker, it is both canvas and medium, both that which he measures, and that which gives meaning to his measurements." He moved to a magnificent long-case clock of walnut and brass, its pendulum suspended in mid-swing. To stop time at a specific moment suggests significance. Our killer is either sending a message or preserving evidence. "Evidence? Of what nature?" Lestrade asked, his brow furrowed. "That, Inspector, is what we must determine." Holmes's fingers hovered above the clock face without touching it. 17 minutes past 2, not a conventional hour for an appointment, nor for a murder. Why this specific time? The question hung in the air, unanswered but resonant, like the echo of a bell long after it has been struck. Watson moved toward the shop's front windows, peering out at the street, now shrouded in evening's full embrace. Gas lamps created halos in the fog, their light diffused into soft, golden spheres. A few passers-by hurried along, collars turned up against the chill, while others lingered at the edges of the small crowd still gathered to glimpse whatever mystery might be unfolding within. "It seems our Mr. Tiller was well regarded in the neighbourhood," Watson remarked, noting the genuine concern on the faces outside. No shortage of mourners. Holmes joined him at the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "Yes, a man of routine and reliability, virtues highly prized in his profession. His neighbours would have set their own timepieces by his habits." He paused, his gaze shifting to something across the street. Curious. Watson followed his friend's line of sight to a figure standing partially concealed in the shadow of a neighbouring building. A woman, her face obscured by a veil, her posture suggesting both hesitation and purpose. "What do you make of our observer, Watson?" Before the doctor could respond, the woman seemed to sense their attention. She retreated further into the shadows, before turning and walking swiftly away, her skirts sweeping the ground in a hushed rhythm. "Should we follow her?" Watson asked, already reaching for his hat. Holmes considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. I suspect she will return when the crowd has dispersed. For now, we have an apprentice to interview." They took their leave of Lestrade, who promised to have the body transported to the morgue for a more thorough examination. As they stepped back into the fog-laden street, the sounds of London enveloped them once more. The distant whistle of a steam engine, the calls of vendors closing their stalls for the night, the occasional laughter spilling from a nearby public house. The bakery that housed Thomas Merrick's lodgings was closed for the day, but a light burned in the window above. The scent of fresh bread still lingered in the air, comforting and ordinary in contrast to the strange atmosphere they had just left behind. A narrow staircase led to a door on which Holmes rapped softly. After a moment it opened to reveal a young man of perhaps 25 years, his face pale with shock and lack of sleep. His hands, like his master's, bore the marks of his trade, though he showed the eager mistakes of one still learning, small cuts and burns that had not yet had time to fade into the badges of experience. "Mr. Merrick?" Holmes inquired gently. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are assisting Inspector Lestrade with the investigation into your master's death. Might we have a few moments of your time?" The young man nodded numbly, stepping back to admit them to his modest quarters. A single room served as both bedroom and living space, with a small table near the window covered in clockwork parts and tools, evidence that Merrick practiced his craft even in his private hours. "I've already told the police everything I know," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I found him this morning when I arrived to open the shop. He was just lying there, and all the clocks—" He trailed off, his hands making a helpless gesture. "Yes, the clocks," Holmes acknowledged, taking the seat Merrick offered him. "Tell me, what was the significance of 17 minutes past 2 to your master? Did he mention any appointment at that hour?" Merrick shook his head, confusion evident in his expression. "No, sir. Mr. Tiller kept regular hours. The shop closed at 6, and he was rarely there past 7, except on Thursdays, when he would take inventory until perhaps 8 or 9. "And yesterday was not Thursday," Holmes observed. "No, sir. Tuesday. Yet he had an appointment at 8:30. according to his notebook, with someone identified only as PM. Does that set of initials hold any significance to you?" The apprentice's brow furrowed as he considered. "No. Most of Mr. Tiller's clients were recorded by their full names. He was very particular about his records." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to the clockwork spread across the table. Among the gears and springs lay a half-assembled pocket watch, its inner workings exposed like a tiny mechanical heart awaiting the spark of life. "You are learning your craft well," Holmes remarked, nodding toward the timepiece. "Your master must have held you in high regard." A flush of pride momentarily overcame Merrick's grief. "He was teaching me everything he knew, said I had a natural feel for the balance of a good mechanism." The young man swallowed hard, emotion threatening to overwhelm him again. "I can't imagine who would want to harm him, Mr. Holmes. He was a fair man, honest in his dealings." Watson, who had been quietly observing from near the door, stepped forward. "Has he seemed troubled recently? Perhaps concerned about someone or something?" Merrick hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "Well, there was one thing, though it may be nothing." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "In matters such as these, Mr. Merrick, what seems like nothing often proves quite the contrary. It's just that, last week, he received a pocket watch for repair. A beautiful piece, gold, with an unusual engraving on the inside cover. When I asked him about it, he became distant, said it was an old commission coming back to him, and that he alone would handle its repair." "Did you happen to see this engraving?" Holmes inquired, his tone casual, despite the intensity of his gaze. Merrick nodded slowly. "Just briefly. It was a train, Mr. Holmes. A steam engine rendered in remarkable detail, with a number beneath it. I believe it was 2117. Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance, the significance of the number in relation to the frozen clocks lost on neither of them. "And this watch," Holmes continued, "was it among those in the shop this morning?" "No, sir," Merrick replied, his voice dropping lower, as if sharing a confidence. "That's what's strange. Mr. Tiller kept it in a special case in his desk drawer. I checked when I realized what had happened, thinking perhaps it had been a theft gone wrong. But the watch was gone, and there was no sign of the case either." Outside, the fog continued to thicken, wrapping London in its gentle embrace as the night deepened. The distant chime of a church bell marked the hour, its sound muffled and dreamlike through the mist. Within the apprentice's small room, the revelation hung in the air like the lingering note of that far-off bell, the first real clue in the mystery of the clockmaker's death. Holmes rose to his feet, his decision made. "Thank you, Mr. Merrick. You have been most helpful. Should you recall anything else, no matter how insignificant it might seem, please send a word to me at once." He reached into his pocket, producing a card, which he handed to the young man. 221B Baker Street. Any messenger will find me there." As they descended the narrow staircase and emerged once more onto the street, Watson turned to his friend with the question that now pressed upon his mind. "The train engraving, Holmes. You believe it connects to the time displayed on the clocks?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the gaslight as he hailed a passing hansom. 217, Watson. Not merely a time, but perhaps a number of significance to both the victim and his killer. He gestured for Watson to enter the cab first. "I believe our next inquiry should be at the offices of Bradshaw's Railway Guide. If 2:17 represents a scheduled departure, we may find ourselves one step closer to understanding why a respected clockmaker met his end surrounded by the frozen moments of his life's work. As the hansom pulled away, merging into the flow of London's evening traffic, the shop of Edward Tiller receded behind them, a small island of stillness in the ever-moving current of the city. Within its walls, dozens of clocks continued their silent vigil, their hands aligned in mute testimony to a moment that had somehow sealed their maker's fate. The mystery had only begun to unwind, like the spring of a clock carefully released to measure out the moments of truth that lay ahead. The fog swallowed the cab as it turned a corner, the sound of hooves on cobblestones fading into the gentle symphony of London at night. A city of secrets, slowly settling into dreams, unaware that somewhere among its winding streets, the answer to the clockmaker's final hours waited to be discovered. The offices of Bradshaw's railway guide occupied a modest building near Charing Cross Station, where the constant rumble of trains arriving and departing provided a fitting backdrop to the business of cataloguing the nation's rail schedules. Despite the late hour, a clerk remained at his desk, surrounded by stacks of timetables and correspondence from various railway companies across Britain. Holmes and Watson were shown in by a drowsy office boy who had clearly been anticipating the end of his workday, rather than the arrival of visitors. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that magnified his already prominent eyes, looked up with mild surprise as they entered. "Gentlemen, I was just about to close for the evening. How may I be of assistance?" Holmes approached the desk with that quiet authority he so often displayed. "My apologies for the late call. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We require information regarding a particular train service, specifically any departures or arrivals scheduled for 2:17. The clerk blinked owlishly behind his spectacles. 2:17, sir. Morning or evening?" "Both, if you please," Holmes replied, "and with particular attention to services connecting to or from Soho." "Soho has no station of its own, Mr. Holmes," the clerk informed him, already reaching for a thick volume, bound in green leather. "The closest would be Charing Cross, Piccadilly, or perhaps Oxford Circus." "Then let us begin with those," Holmes suggested, his patience evident despite the urgency that Watson knew he must feel. The clerk thumbed through the pages with practiced efficiency, his finger tracing down columns of times and destinations. The lamp on his desk cast a warm glow over the proceedings, creating a small island of light in the otherwise dimming office. Outside, the last rays of daylight had long since faded, giving way to the gaslit glow of London after dark. "Here we are," the clerk announced, after several minutes of consultation. "The only service departing at precisely 2:17 is the Brighton line from Victoria Station, stopping at Clapham Junction, Croydon, and several points south before terminating at Brighton at 4:40. Holmes leaned closer, examining the entry. "And in the morning, any 2:17 departures?" Another flutter of pages. "Yes, sir. The North Western Railway has a 2:17 departure from Euston to Birmingham, and there is a Great Western service departing Paddington for Bristol at the same time." Watson watched as Holmes absorbed this information, his mind visibly working behind those keen eyes. The detective tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, a rhythm almost like the clicking of a clock's mechanism. "And arrivals?" Holmes inquired. "Any trains scheduled to arrive in London at 2:17? The clerk consulted his records once more. 3, Mr. Holmes. A service from Canterbury arrives at Victoria at 2:17 precisely. There is also a train from Cambridge arriving at Liverpool Street, and one from Dover arriving at Charing Cross. Holmes straightened, a subtle shift in his posture that Watson recognized as interest piqued. The Dover train. Might I see that entry specifically? The clerk turned the volume so Holmes could examine it himself. Watson moved closer to his friend, following his gaze to the neatly printed schedule. Charing Cross, ARR 2:17 p.m. daily, from Dover via Canterbury and Ashford. Dover, Holmes murmured, almost to himself. The gateway to the continent. Watson's mind immediately followed Holmes's reasoning. You believe our clockmaker's murder might be connected to someone arriving from or departing to the continent. It is a possibility worth considering, Holmes replied, his voice low enough that only Watson could hear. A pocket watch with a train engraving, clocks stopped at the precise time of a continental connection. These are not coincidences, Watson. He turned back to the clerk, who was watching them with undisguised curiosity. I would like to know if there have been any recent changes to these schedules. Has the Dover train always arrived at precisely 2:17? The clerk's brow furrowed in thought. As a matter of fact, no, sir. There was a timetable adjustment approximately 3 weeks ago. Prior to that, the Dover service arrived at 2:25. The railway company adjusted several of their schedules to improve connections. I see. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And one final question, if you would be so kind. Does the number 217 have any other significance in railway terms? A locomotive number, perhaps, or a particular service? The clerk hesitated, then reached beneath his desk to produce another volume, this one bound in red. This is our registry of locomotive numbers and classes. Let me check for you. He flipped through the pages with practiced ease, scanning the columns of numbers and specifications. Ah, here we are. Engine number 217 is a Great Western Express locomotive, built at Swindon Works in 1890, currently assigned to the London to Bristol route. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that particular light Watson knew so well, the thrill of connection, of pattern emerging from chaos. Thank you, sir. You have been most helpful. As they stepped back out into the London night, the fog had begun to thin slightly, allowing glimpses of stars between the shifting clouds. The air carried the mingled scents of the city, coal smoke, horse dung, the river's damp breath, and the indefinable essence of thousands of lives being lived in close proximity. So, Holmes, Watson began as they walked toward the main road to find a cab. Do you believe the timepiece engraving referred to locomotive number 217, or to the Dover train's arrival time? Holmes drew his coat more tightly around him against the evening chill. Both possibilities merit consideration, though I am inclined toward the latter. The synchronicity is too precise to ignore. Every clock in Tiller's shop stopped at the exact time the Dover train now arrives in London. They walked in companionable silence for a few moments, their footsteps echoing softly on the pavement. A distant ship's horn sounded from the direction of the Thames, a melancholy note in the night. We should call upon Victoria Station tomorrow, Holmes decided. I would like to speak with the station master about passengers arriving on recent Dover trains. But first, I believe a return visit to Mr. Tiller's shop is in order. There are aspects of the scene I wish to examine in daylight. the hansom cab that bore them back toward Baker Street moved through streets growing quieter as the evening deepened. Gas lamps created pools of golden light at regular intervals, like beacons guiding travellers through the urban fog. Within the cab, Holmes had fallen into one of his thoughtful silences, his chin resting on his chest, eyes half closed, but mind clearly active. Watson knew better than to interrupt these moments of contemplation. Instead, he watched London drift by through the cab's window, considering what they had learned. A clockmaker murdered, his shop frozen at a specific moment in time, a connection to trains and perhaps to the continent. Wheels within wheels, like the intricate mechanisms that had been Edward Tiller's life's work. Morning found them once again in Soho, the street outside Tiller's shop considerably quieter than it had been the previous evening. A constable still stood guard at the door, but admitted them immediately upon recognizing Holmes. Daylight, filtering through the shop's windows and the thinning fog outside, cast the interior in a different aspect than the gaslit gloom of the previous evening. Dust motes danced in the slanting beams of light, and the brass and wood of the many timepieces gleamed warmly. The body had been removed, but a dark stain on the floorboards remained as mute testimony to the violence that had occurred. Holmes moved methodically through the shop, examining elements he had noted the night before, but now with the advantage of better light. He paid particular attention to the clockmaker's workbench, opening drawers and studying the arrangement of tools with minute attention. "Watson, come look at this," he called softly, indicating a leather-bound ledger he had discovered in a drawer beneath the bench. Tiller's client registry. The book lay open to reveal pages of neat entries in the clockmaker's hand, names, dates, descriptions of timepieces left for repair or commissioned, and fees charged or paid. Holmes traced a finger down the most recent page, stopping at an entry dated approximately 3 weeks prior. P. Morwood, repair of Gold Hunter pocket watch with engraving. Special commission, 10 guineas, paid in full. P.M., Watson murmured, the same initials from Tiller's appointment book. Indeed, Holmes agreed, and note the date. It coincides with the railway timetable change the clerk mentioned yesterday. Our Mr. Tiller repaired a watch for P. Morwood just as the Dover train's arrival time was adjusted to 2:17. Holmes continued his examination of the ledger, turning back several pages with careful attention. "Interesting," he remarked. "This is not the first transaction between Tiller and Morwood. There are entries dating back nearly 2 years, all involving repairs to the same watch." "A troublesome timepiece," Watson suggested. "Or a convenient excuse for regular meetings," Holmes countered, his expression thoughtful. "Note that each repair commanded a substantial fee, yet the descriptions of work performed are unusually vague for a man otherwise so meticulous in his record-keeping." He closed the ledger and replaced it in the drawer, his movements deliberate and precise. "I believe we should inquire about Mr. P. Morwood. His connection to our clockmaker appears significant." Their search of the shop continued, Holmes examining each clock with careful attention, occasionally making notes in his small pocketbook. Watson, meanwhile, turned his attention to a secretary desk in the corner, where it appeared Tiller had managed the business aspects of his trade. "Holmes," he called, after several minutes of sorting through papers, "I believe I've found something of interest." He held up a small card, yellowed with age and worn at the edges from frequent handling. Upon it was printed, Continental Express Shipping Services. Discreet transport guaranteed. Dover to Calais daily. Holmes took the card, turning it over to reveal handwritten numbers on the reverse. A sequence that appeared to be dates, followed by times. Well done, Watson. It seems our clockmaker had regular dealings with a shipping service operating between England and France. As he pocketed the card, a soft knock sounded at the shop's door. The constable opened it to reveal a young boy of perhaps 12 years, cap in hand, looking nervous but determined. "Begging your pardon, sir," he addressed the constable, "but I'm looking for Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I was told he might be here." Holmes stepped forward. "I am Holmes. What can I do for you, young man?" The boy straightened, clearly impressed to be addressing the famous detective. "Message for you, sir. From a lady." He extended a small envelope, sealed with plain wax. "She gave me a shilling to bring it straight away, and said it was most urgent." Holmes accepted the envelope, extracting a half-crown from his waistcoat pocket and pressing it into the boy's hand. "When and where did this lady give you the message?" "Just now, sir. By the fountain in Golden Square. Veiled she was, all in black. Said you'd want to know right away." Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, clearly thinking, as Watson was, of the veiled figure they had observed the previous evening. "Thank you," Holmes told the boy. "You've been most helpful." After the messenger had departed, Holmes broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the single sheet it contained. The handwriting was elegant, but showed signs of haste. "Mr. Holmes, if you wish to understand Edward's death, come to the Rose and Crown on Great Windmill Street at noon. Ask for a private room and wait for me there. Tell no one. My life depends on your discretion." "M." "M," Watson remarked, reading over Holmes's shoulder. "Morwood, perhaps." "It seems a reasonable supposition," Holmes agreed, checking his pocket watch. "It is just 11:30 now. We have time to make the appointment." The Rose and Crown proved to be a respectable establishment that catered primarily to the theatrical community from the nearby playhouses. At this hour, it was relatively quiet, with only a few patrons lingering over late breakfasts or early luncheons. The landlord, a portly man with impressive side whiskers, showed them to a small private parlour at the rear of the building without comment, when Holmes made the request. Fire burned cheerfully in the grate, taking the edge off the autumn chill, and the room was comfortably appointed with a round table and several chairs. "Shall I bring you gentlemen something while you wait?" the landlord inquired. "Coffee, if you please," Holmes replied. "And perhaps some of your excellent mutton pies that I see advertised." Watson raised an eyebrow as the man departed. "You've been here before?" "On occasion," Holmes acknowledged, with a slight smile. "Their pies are indeed quite good, and the landlord is a discreet fellow who asks few questions of his guests. A useful establishment to know." They did not have long to wait. Precisely at noon, a soft knock sounded at the parlour door. Holmes called for their visitor to enter, and the door opened to reveal a woman dressed in deep mourning, her face concealed behind a heavy veil. She closed the door carefully behind her before raising the veil to reveal a face of striking beauty, though pale with evident distress. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark hair arranged simply beneath her hat, and eyes that held both intelligence and apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she acknowledged them with a slight nod. "Thank you for coming. I am Margaret Morwood." Holmes rose, indicating a chair for their visitor. "Mrs. Morwood, I confess we have been hoping to make your acquaintance." She settled into the offered seat, her movements betraying tension, despite her composed expression. "Then you already know something of my connection to Edward Tiller. We know that you, or perhaps your husband, were a client of his," Holmes replied carefully, "and that you were scheduled to meet with him on the evening of his death." A flicker of surprise crossed her features. "Not my husband, Mr. Holmes. I am a widow these past 3 years. And yes, I was to meet Edward that evening." Her voice caught slightly. "But I was delayed. By the time I arrived at his shop, it was past 10 o'clock, and there was no answer to my knock. I assumed he had tired of waiting and returned home." "Yet you observed us at the shop yesterday evening," Holmes noted, his tone gentle but direct. "Why not approach us then?" Mrs. Morwood's gloved hands twisted in her lap. "Fear, Mr. Holmes. When I learned of Edward's death this morning, it was in the newspaper, though not prominently. I feared I might be suspected. And more than that," she glanced toward the door, as if concerned about being overheard, "I feared whoever killed him might come for me next." "And why would you believe that, Mrs. Morwood?" Holmes asked, leaning forward slightly. She drew a deep breath, visibly steeling herself. "Because Edward and I were involved in something that some would consider questionable. Not illegal, you understand, but sensitive. It concerned my late husband's work." "And what was that work?" Watson inquired when she hesitated. "Philip was an engineer with the Admiralty," she explained. "His specialty was the design of navigation instruments for the Royal Navy. Before his death, he became concerned about certain specifications being compromised." "Espionage," Holmes stated simply. She nodded, a single tear escaping to trace down her cheek. "He believed someone within the Admiralty was selling secrets to foreign powers. He began keeping records, documenting discrepancies. When he died, a boating accident, they said, I found his notes hidden in his pocket watch, the very watch I later brought to Edward." "The gold hunter with the train engraving," Holmes supplied. "Yes, the train was Philip's passion outside his work. He had been documenting railway innovations for years. The watch was his prized possession." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Edward was an old friend of Philip's. When I found the hidden compartment in the watch containing Philip's notes, I didn't know who to trust. Edward agreed to help me decipher them and determine what to do." The narrative was interrupted by the arrival of the landlord with their coffee and pies. They waited in silence until he had departed, closing the door behind him. "These meetings, disguised as watch repairs," Holmes prompted, once they were alone again. "They were to discuss your husband's findings." "Yes, we were careful, or so we thought. Edward would extract the notes, we would discuss them, and then he would replace them in the watch's secret compartment before I left." Her voice faltered. "Our last meeting, he told me he had identified the traitor. He had found a pattern in Philip's notes that pointed to a specific individual. We were to meet Tuesday night, so he could show me the evidence." "And the significance of 217? Holmes asked quietly. Mrs. Morwood looked startled. "How did you—" She shook her head in wonder. "The train from Dover. Philip had discovered that classified documents were being transported to France on that service. It's why he chose that number for his coded notes, a reference to the time. But the schedule changed recently." 3 weeks ago, Holmes confirmed. "Just when you brought the watch back to Tiller for another repair." "Yes. Edward needed to adjust his calculations based on the new timetable. He believed the next exchange of information was imminent. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Holmes, the watch is missing. If it falls into the wrong hands, years of my husband's work will be compromised. And whoever killed Edward may realize that I know their identity as well." Holmes considered her words, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Mrs. Morwood, this watch, did it have any distinguishing features beyond the train engraving? Anything that might help us identify it if found?" She nodded. "Inside the cover, beneath the engraving, Philip had our initials inscribed, PM and MM, intertwined with a date, June 17th, 1888. It's our wedding anniversary. And you have no idea who Edward suspected as the traitor?" "None. He was being cautious, and said he needed to be absolutely certain before making such a serious accusation." She glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. "I cannot stay longer. I'm expected at my sister's home in Kensington, and my absence would be remarked upon." Holmes nodded, understanding. "One final question, if I may. The Continental Express shipping service, was it connected to your husband's concerns?" A shadow crossed her face. "Yes. Philip believed it was being used as a cover for the transfer of sensitive documents. The company has offices near both Dover and Charing Cross stations." As Mrs. Morwood prepared to leave, replacing her veil, Holmes offered reassurance. "We will look into this matter with the utmost discretion. If you would leave an address where we might contact you should the need arise." She provided the information, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote it on a page from Holmes's notebook. "Please be careful, Mr. Holmes. These people, whoever they are, have already taken 2 lives dear to me. I couldn't bear to have more blood on my conscience." After she had gone, Holmes and Watson sat in thoughtful silence, the remains of their meal forgotten. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the room's worn but comfortable furnishings. "What do you make of her story, Holmes?" Watson finally asked. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his gaze distant. "Credible in its essentials, though I suspect she has not told us everything. Naval secrets, a murdered engineer, a clockmaker killed when he uncovers the truth. It has the ring of authenticity." "And our next step?" "Charing Cross Station, I think," Holmes decided. "I would like to observe the Dover train's arrival at 2:17, and perhaps pay a visit to the offices of Continental Express Shipping afterward." He rose, reaching for his hat and coat. "The game is afoot, Watson. We have approximately 2 hours before the train is due, just enough time for a visit to Scotland Yard to inform Lestrade of our progress." As they stepped back out into the London day, the fog had lifted entirely, revealing a sky of pale blue scattered with clouds like fragments of torn cotton. The city hummed with the energy of commerce and life, unaware of the threads of intrigue and danger that Holmes and Watson now followed. Threads that had led to one death already, and threatened more to come. The mystery of the clockmaker's final hours was beginning to take shape, like the emerging form of a timepiece assembled from scattered components. Yet, many pieces still remained to be discovered and fitted into place before the mechanism of truth could begin its steady, revealing tick. Charing Cross Station hummed with the particular energy of a major railway terminus in the afternoon hours. Streams of passengers flowed across the concourse beneath the vast glass and iron roof that arched overhead, like the ribcage of some enormous beast. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, catching motes of dust and steam in golden beams that cut through the cavernous space. The air was thick with the mingled scents of coal smoke, oil, and humanity, while the cacophony of whistles, chugging engines, and countless conversations created a symphony unique to these cathedrals of modern travel. Holmes and Watson positioned themselves on the main concourse with a clear view of Platform 4, where the Dover train was due to arrive. Holmes had insisted they arrive early, allowing time to observe not just the train's arrival, but the preparations for it. Now he stood with the calm alertness of a hunter, his keen eyes missing nothing as railway staff bustled about their duties. "Notice the man by the luggage office, Watson," Holmes murmured, giving a subtle nod toward a tall figure in a porter's uniform. "He has checked his pocket watch 3 times in the past 5 minutes, yet he has no train to meet. His attention seems focused on that doorway to the left of the ticket office." Watson followed his friend's gaze to observe the porter, who indeed seemed more concerned with the time and the doorway than with any duties he might have been assigned. "Perhaps he's waiting for someone." "Perhaps," Holmes agreed, though his posture suggests tension rather than anticipation. See how he stands, weight on the balls of his feet, ready for movement. And that uniform fits him poorly around the shoulders and wrists. Not a man accustomed to physical labour, I think. As they watched, a railway official approached the platform, consulting a clipboard. "The Dover train is signalled, gentlemen," he announced to the waiting passengers. "Arrival in approximately 7 minutes. Holmes checked his own watch. 10 minutes to 2:17. Right on schedule. He turned to Watson with a meaningful glance. "Let us wander toward that doorway our nervous porter seems so interested in." They moved casually through the crowd, Holmes pausing occasionally as if searching for someone, his actions disguising their true purpose. As they neared the doorway, Watson noticed a small brass plaque beside it. "Continental Express Shipping, Private Office." "Ah?" Holmes breathed, the single syllable conveying satisfaction. "The pieces align, Watson." The door opened at that moment, revealing a compact office space beyond. A middle-aged man in a well-cut but unremarkable suit emerged, carrying a small leather case. He pulled the door closed behind him, locked it, and pocketed the key before setting off toward the platform with brisk, purposeful strides. "Mr. Langley, sir." The porter. Holmes had been observing, hurried forward, touching his cap in a gesture of deference that didn't quite match his alert eyes. "Allow me to take your case." "Thank you, porter," the man called Langley replied, surrendering the case with evident reluctance. "Platform 4, as usual." "Yes, sir. The Dover train will be arriving momentarily." Holmes touched Watson's arm lightly. "Come, let us not lose sight of them." They followed at a discreet distance as Langley and the porter made their way to Platform 4, where a growing crowd of passengers and well-wishers had gathered. The distant sound of a locomotive whistle announced the train's approach, and a ripple of anticipation moved through those waiting. With a great hiss of steam and the screech of brakes, the Dover train pulled into the station precisely at 2:17. Doors opened along its length, disgorging passengers onto the platform. Businessmen returning from continental affairs, families concluding holidays, solitary travellers with purposes unknown. The usual organised chaos of a train's arrival ensued, with porters calling out, passengers searching for luggage or companions, and railway staff ensuring the smooth flow of operations. Through this tumult, Holmes kept his eyes fixed on Langley and his porter. The two men moved purposefully toward the first-class carriages, where a distinguished gentleman with a silver-streaked beard and elegant overcoat was descending to the platform. "Ah, Langley," the new arrival greeted, his accent faintly Germanic. "Prompt as always." "Sir Wilhelm," Langley replied with a small bow, "I trust your journey was comfortable?" "As comfortable as can be expected," Sir Wilhelm answered, handing his walking stick to the porter so he could adjust his gloves. "Do you have the materials I requested?" Langley nodded toward the case still carried by the porter. "Everything is prepared, just as you specified." Holmes leaned closer to Watson. "Sir Wilhelm von Kram," he whispered. "Ostensibly a banking representative from Prussia, but with connections to diplomatic circles. I encountered him peripherally during the affair of the Netherlands-Sumatra Company last year." As they watched, the three men began moving toward the station exit, the porter still carrying both the leather case and Sir Wilhelm's walking stick. They moved with the assured confidence of those conducting perfectly legitimate business, yet something in their manner, a certain wariness in their glances, perhaps, spoke of more clandestine purposes. "Shall we follow them?" Watson inquired quietly. Holmes considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. I think we would be better served by examining the office they just left." He nodded toward the Continental Express shipping door. "And I believe an opportunity presents itself." A station official was approaching the door with a ring of keys, apparently making rounds to check the various offices. Holmes stepped forward smoothly, intercepting the man with a disarming smile. "Pardon me," he began, producing a card from his pocket. "Sherlock Holmes. I'm assisting Scotland Yard with inquiries and would appreciate a few moments in the Continental Express office." The official examined the card with appropriate respect, though his expression remained doubtful. "I'm not supposed to allow access without authorization from the company, Mr. Holmes." "I understand entirely." Holmes nodded sympathetically. "However, Inspector Lestrade specifically requested this as part of an ongoing investigation." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "A matter of some delicacy, involving certain irregularities in shipping manifests." The mention of Lestrade and the hint of official business did its work. The official hesitated only briefly before selecting a key from his ring. "I suppose there's no harm. So long as nothing is disturbed, I can give you 10 minutes, sir, no more." "Most generous," Holmes assured him as the door was unlocked. "We shall be the very soul of discretion." Once inside, with the door closed behind them, Holmes's casual demeanor transformed into focused intensity. The office was small but efficiently arranged, with a desk bearing a blotter and telephone, filing cabinets against one wall, and a large map of the English Channel and surrounding coasts displayed prominently. "Quick, Watson," Holmes murmured, already moving toward the desk. "We have limited time." He began a systematic examination of the desktop, careful not to disturb anything visibly. Watson, following his friend's lead, turned his attention to the filing cabinets, finding them unlocked, perhaps due to Langley's hasty departure. "Client records," Watson noted, scanning the neatly labeled folders. "Organized alphabetically." "Look for Morwood," Holmes suggested, carefully opening the desk drawer, "or any reference to Admiralty or naval contracts." They worked in practiced silence, years of collaboration having honed their investigative partnership to wordless efficiency. Watson methodically checked the files, while Holmes examined the contents of the drawers with rapid precision. "Here," Watson announced, after a few moments. "A folder labelled Admiralty Liaison, Confidential. But it's empty, Holmes. Just an empty folder." Holmes glanced up from his examination of the desk blotter. "Interesting. Someone has removed the contents, and recently too. See the lack of dust on that folder compared to its neighbours." His attention returned to the blotter, where he was carefully angling it to catch the light. "Ah, Watson, come look at this. The impression of recent writing." Watson joined him at the desk, where Holmes had positioned the blotter to reveal the faint indentations left by a pen on papers that had rested there during composition. Though not fully legible, certain words could be discerned. Delivery confirmed, schedule adjusted, and most tellingly, tea elimination necessary. "Tea," Watson breathed. "Tiller?" "It would appear so," Holmes agreed grimly. "Written within the past day or two, judging by the clarity of the impression." He produced his pocket knife and carefully scraped a small sample of ink residue from the blotter into a folded paper envelope. "Prussian blue ink compound, if I'm not mistaken. Rather distinctive." A quick rapped. The door interrupted their investigation. "Time's up, gentlemen," came the official's voice. "Just concluding," Holmes called back pleasantly, quickly restoring everything to its precise position. As they exited, he thanked the official warmly. "Most helpful. I shall be sure to mention your cooperation to Inspector Lestrade." They made their way back to the main concourse, now somewhat less crowded, as the Dover train's arrival receded into the station's continuous rhythm of comings and goings. Holmes led them to a quiet corner near a refreshment stand, where they could speak without being overheard. "Well, Watson, what do we make of these developments?" Watson considered, organizing his thoughts as he had learned to do through years of documenting Holmes's cases. Continental Express appears to be facilitating meetings between this Langley fellow and foreign contacts, including Sir Wilhelm. The empty Admiralty file suggests they're handling sensitive information, possibly the very naval secrets Mrs. Morwood mentioned. And the note about tea elimination strongly suggests they ordered Tiller's murder once he had uncovered their operation. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely. And I would add that the timing is significant. The Dover train's schedule change 3 weeks ago precipitated these events. Perhaps it disrupted their established routine, forcing adjustments that increased the risk of discovery." He glanced at the station clock. "It is now approaching 3. I believe our next move should be to locate Thomas Merrick again." "The apprentice? You suspect his involvement?" "Not as a conspirator," Holmes clarified, "but as Tiller's apprentice, he may have observed more than he realizes. And he may be in danger himself, if our shipping agents fear he shared his master's knowledge." They found a hansom cab outside the station and directed it back toward Soho. The afternoon had advanced, bringing with it a subtle shift in London's atmosphere. The clarity of midday had given way to the softer, more diffuse light of approaching evening. Chimney smoke hung in layers above the rooftops, and the city's tempo had altered, the purposeful bustle of business hours gradually yielding to the different rhythms of the coming night. The cab let them off at the bakery where Merrick lodged, but the young apprentice was not in his room. The baker's wife, kneading dough with flour-covered hands, informed them that Thomas had left earlier to visit Tiller's shop, having received permission from the police to collect some of his personal tools. He was quite agitated, poor lad, she added, pausing in her work. Said something about remembering an important detail he'd overlooked. Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance of shared concern before hurrying toward the clockmaker's shop. The constable who had been posted at the door was notably absent when they arrived, and the shop door stood slightly ajar. An ominous detail that caused Holmes to reach inside his coat for his revolver. "Stay behind me, Watson," he murmured, pushing the door open with his free hand. The shop's interior was dim, the afternoon light barely penetrating the dusty windows. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust, revealing a scene of disruption that contrasted sharply with the orderly space they had left that morning. Drawers had been pulled open, their contents spilled across countertops and floor. Several clocks had been disturbed, their glass faces cracked, or doors hanging open to reveal the silent mechanisms within. "Merrick?" Holmes called, advancing cautiously. "Thomas Merrick, are you here?" A faint groan answered from the back of the shop. They moved quickly toward the sound, finding the apprentice slumped against the workbench, a dark stain spreading across his temple where he had been struck. Watson immediately knelt beside the young man, his doctor's instincts taking precedence. "He's alive," he reported, gently examining the wound. "A nasty blow, but the skull appears intact." Merrick's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition and then urgent concern. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, attempting to sit upright despite Watson's restraining hand. "They were here, looking for something. I tried to stop them, but—" "Easy, lad," Watson soothed. "You've had a serious blow. Don't exert yourself." Holmes crouched beside them, his voice gentle but insistent. "Who, Merrick? Who was here?" "Two men," the apprentice managed, wincing as Watson dabbed at his wound with a handkerchief. "One tall, like a porter or labourer. The other is smaller, well-dressed. They didn't see me at first. I was in the storage room when they entered. They were searching everywhere, tearing things apart." "What were they looking for?" Holmes pressed. "A watch," they said. "A special watch with an engraving." Merrick's eyes widened with the recollection. "That's why I came back today. I remembered something about Mr. Tiller's movements the day before he died. He took the gold watch, the one with the train engraving, and did something unusual with it." Holmes leaned closer, his attention absolute. "What did he do, Thomas?" "He hid it," the apprentice replied, "inside another timepiece. I saw him through the workshop doorway, though he didn't know I was watching." He opened the case of the Austrian cuckoo clock, the one commissioned last month by the diplomat from Vienna, and concealed the pocket watch within its mechanism. Holmes straightened, his gaze immediately locating the clock in question. An elaborate piece mounted on the wall opposite, its decorative pine-cone weights still hanging motionless beneath. The face showed 2:17, like all the others, but unlike many in the shop, it appeared undisturbed by the searchers. "They didn't find it," Merrick confirmed, following Holmes's gaze. "They were asking me where it might be when we heard someone at the door. That's when the bigger man struck me. They left through the back entrance." Holmes moved swiftly to the cuckoo clock, carefully lifting it from its wall bracket. "Watson, would you assist Mr. Merrick to a chair? I believe he could use a moment to recover while I examine this." As Watson helped the dazed apprentice to a seat, Holmes carried the clock to the workbench and began a careful inspection. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The wooden case hand-carved with alpine scenes and forest creatures in remarkable detail. Holmes located the access panel at the rear and opened it with delicate precision, revealing the complex mechanism within. "Ingenious," he murmured appreciatively. Tiller modified the weight chamber to create a hiding place. His fingers worked with surgeon-like delicacy, manipulating a small lever that caused a previously invisible compartment to slide open. "Ah, here we are." He extracted a gleaming object from within, a gold pocket watch of evident quality and age. The case was smooth and undecorated, save for a subtle pattern of wear that spoke of years of handling by its owner. Holmes opened it carefully to reveal the watch face, the hands frozen at 2:17 like every other clock in the shop. "The interior cover, Holmes," Watson reminded him, having settled Merrick comfortably and rejoined his friend. Holmes nodded, locating the nearly invisible catch that opened the secret compartment within the watch's cover. Inside was engraved the small but detailed image of a steam locomotive, the number 217 beneath it. And below that, just as Mrs. Morwood had described, were the intertwined initials PM and MM with the date of their wedding anniversary. But where are the notes she mentioned? Watson wondered, peering over Holmes's shoulder. Holmes examined the compartment more closely, his fingers probing its edges. A false bottom, perhaps? Or... He paused, holding the watch up to catch the light at different angles. "Look here, Watson, the engraving itself." Watson leaned closer, at first seeing only the train image and initials. Then, as Holmes adjusted the angle once more, he gasped softly in admiration. "Micro-engraving. The lines of the train contain text." "Precisely," Holmes confirmed. "Tiller must have used his jeweler's tools to extract the information from Morwood's original notes and transfer it to this more permanent and discreet medium. A brilliant solution. The information hides in plain sight, visible only to those who know precisely how to look." He carefully returned the watch to his waistcoat pocket. "We should get young Mr. Merrick to safety," he decided. "And then, I believe, we have an appointment to keep with Mrs. Morwood." They helped the apprentice to his feet, supporting him between them as they made their way outside. The constable had returned to his post and looked startled at their emergence with the injured young man. "These gentlemen assaulted Mr. Merrick and ransacked the shop," Holmes informed him crisply. "Two men, one tall in workman's clothes, the other smaller and well-dressed. They departed through the rear not 15 minutes ago. I suggest you inform Inspector Lestrade immediately and have men search the vicinity." As the constable hurried to comply, Holmes hailed a passing cab. "Baker Street," he instructed the driver, "and with all possible speed." The journey passed largely in silence, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. Merrick, recovering somewhat from the attack, stared out at the passing streets with the dazed expression of one whose world had been irrevocably altered. Watson maintained a physician's watchful eye on the young man's condition, while Holmes sat deep in contemplation, the recovered watch a tangible weight in his pocket. Mrs. Hudson greeted them at Baker Street with her customary blend of concern and efficiency, quickly providing hot tea and bandages for Merrick's wound. Once the apprentice was settled comfortably before the fire in Holmes's sitting room, the detective dispatched a messenger boy to the address Mrs. Morwood had provided, requesting her immediate presence. "Will you be safe here, Mr. Holmes?" Merrick asked, wincing slightly as Watson applied a fresh dressing to his temple. Those men seemed very determined. "Quite safe," Holmes assured him. "Few locations in London are more secure than these rooms, I assure you, and Watson's revolver provides additional peace of mind." He paced slowly before the window, watching the street below with casual vigilance. "Now, while we await Mrs. Morwood, perhaps you might share anything else you recall about your master's activities in recent weeks. Any visitors? Unusual behavior? Comments that seemed insignificant at the time?" Merrick considered, cradling his teacup in still, trembling hands. He was more secretive than usual about the gold watch, as I mentioned, and he began staying late at the shop more often, not just Thursdays for inventory. Sometimes I would arrive in the morning to find calculations on his desk that weren't related to clockwork. "What sort of calculations?" Holmes inquired, pausing in his pacing. "Schedules," it seemed like. Times, dates, locations written in a kind of shorthand. Merrick frowned in concentration, and there was a map of the Channel coast that he would sometimes study. He always put it away when I entered the room. Holmes nodded encouragingly. "Anything about his visitors?" "Well, Mrs. Morwood came regularly, always at closing time, and there was a gentleman from the railway company who called several times. Mr. Langley, I believe his card said." Holmes and Watson exchanged a significant glance at this confirmation of their suspicions. "Did Tiller ever express any concerns for his safety?" Watson asked. "Any indication he felt threatened?" Merrick hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Not directly, but 3 days before his death, I found him installing a new lock on the workshop door. When I asked about it, he said something odd. He said, 'Time catches up. With every man, Thomas. The trick is to set your watch correctly before it does.' The apprentice looked up with troubled eyes. I didn't understand his meaning then, but now— He knew he was in danger," Holmes finished softly, "and was preparing accordingly." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson announcing the arrival of Mrs. Morwood. The widow entered the room with the same controlled tension they had observed earlier, though her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Merrick with his bandaged head. "What has happened?" she asked, automatically lowering her veil as she closed the door behind her. Holmes gestured for her to take a seat. "Mr. Merrick was attacked by men searching for your husband's watch," he explained. "The same men, I suspect, who killed Edward Tiller." Her gloved hand flew to her mouth. "Did they find it?" "No," Holmes assured her, patting his waistcoat pocket. "Tiller concealed it too well for their hasty search. It is safe." Relief washed visibly over her features. Thank God. Edward promised he would keep it secure. She settled into the offered chair, her gaze moving between the 3 men. "Have you examined its contents? Do you know what it contains?" Holmes nodded. "The micro-engraving in the train image. Quite ingenious, though I have not yet had the opportunity to decipher it fully." "Neither had Edward, at least not completely," she admitted. "The code Philip used was complex, requiring special equipment to read parts of it. Edward was constructing a device to magnify and illuminate the engraving properly." "Such a device might still be at the shop," Merrick suggested, straightening with sudden recollection. He kept a special magnifying apparatus in the drawer with his most delicate tools, the one with the brass handle. Holmes's eyes brightened with interest. "Then we shall retrieve it at the first opportunity. In the meantime, Mrs. Morwood, I believe you may be in considerable danger. The men who killed Tiller and attacked young Merrick will not stop their search." "What do you suggest?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. That you remain here for the present, Holmes decided. Mrs. Hudson can prepare a room. Watson and I will return to Tiller's shop to secure this magnifying device, and then we shall see what secrets your husband's watch has been guarding all this time. As the afternoon light began to wane outside the windows of 221B Baker Street, casting long shadows across the familiar room, the four conspirators found themselves bound together in a web of intrigue that had already claimed one life. The pocket watch rested in Holmes's waistcoat, ticking once more after he had wound it, a mechanical witness to betrayal and murder, carrying within its golden case the truth they all now sought. The game had grown more dangerous, the stakes higher than mere theft or common crime. Somewhere in London, forces were moving to protect secrets worth killing for. Secrets encoded in the delicate engraving of a train marked with the fateful number 217. And as the city prepared for evening, with gas lamps being lit along its winding streets, Sherlock Holmes knew that time was both their ally and their enemy in the race to uncover a clockmaker's final legacy. Evening had settled over London by the time Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street, the special magnifying apparatus from Tiller's shop secured in Holmes's coat pocket. The streets had transformed in that gentle way that cities do as daylight fades, gas lamps creating islands of warm light, windows glowing from within, and the sounds of the day giving way to the more subdued rhythms of night. A fine mist had begun to fall, not quite rain, but enough to soften the edges of buildings and blur the distant glow of lamps into hazy stars. Mrs. Hudson had prepared a light supper, which awaited them in the sitting-room where Mrs. Morwood and Thomas Merrick had remained under the watchful eye of the landlady. Merrick looked considerably improved, the colour having returned to his face, though the bandage on his temple remained a stark reminder of the afternoon's violence. Mrs. Morwood sat near the fire, her veil removed in the safety of Holmes's lodgings, revealing features drawn with worry, but composed with remarkable self-discipline. "You were successful?" she inquired as the two men entered, shaking droplets of mist from their coats. Holmes produced the apparatus from his pocket, a beautifully crafted device of brass and glass that resembled a watchmaker's loop, but with additional lenses that could be rotated into position and a small attachment for an oil lamp. "Mr. Tiller's ingenuity continues to impress," he remarked, placing it carefully on the table. "This is no ordinary magnifier." Merrick leaned forward with professional interest. "He adapted it from a standard jeweler's glass," he explained, "added the extra lenses for viewing at different magnifications and angles. I saw him working on it, but didn't know its purpose." Holmes retrieved the gold pocket watch from his waistcoat and placed it beside the apparatus. In the warm glow of the sitting-room lamps, the watch gleamed with the soft lustre that only years of handling can impart to metal, a patina of human contact that spoke of its importance to its owner. "Before we examine the watch more closely," Holmes said, settling into his chair, "I believe we should establish the full context of this affair. Mrs. Morwood, I must ask you to be completely candid about your husband's work and his suspicions." She nodded, gathering her thoughts as Watson served her a cup of tea. "Philip was a design engineer for naval navigation instruments," she began, her voice low but clear. "He worked primarily on chronometers, highly precise timepieces used by ships to determine longitude at sea. Such instruments are essential for naval operations, particularly for the positioning of vessels in warfare. A sensitive position, Holmes observed, with access to information about naval deployments and capabilities. Yes, about 3 years ago, he began to notice discrepancies in test results for certain instruments. Chronometers that had been calibrated to exacting standards were showing slight variations when deployed on specific vessels. She paused, sipping her tea. At first, he thought it was a technical problem, perhaps a flaw in the manufacturing process. But as he investigated, he found a pattern. The affected instruments were all destined for ships assigned to channel patrols and North Sea deployments. The routes that would monitor movements to and from the continent, Watson noted. Precisely. Philip became convinced the chronometers were being deliberately miscalibrated. Not enough to be immediately apparent, but sufficient to create navigational errors that could place ships miles from their intended positions. Her hands tightened around the teacup. It would mean that certain areas of our coastal waters would be effectively blind to surveillance. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, creating gaps through which unauthorized vessels might pass undetected. Yes, perfect for smuggling or for the clandestine movement of agents and information. Her voice faltered slightly. Philip began keeping careful records of which instruments were affected and which naval officials had authorized their deployment. He didn't know who to trust within the Admiralty, so he documented everything in code, using the engraving in his pocket watch as the key. "And the train imagery," Holmes prompted. "Why choose that particular symbol?" A sad smile touched Mrs. Morwood's lips. Railways were Philip's passion outside his work. He believed they represented the perfect marriage of precision engineering and practical application, much like his chronometers. The train engraving had been in the watch when he inherited it from his father, but he adapted it, adding the micro-engraving within the existing design. Holmes reached for the magnifying apparatus, adjusting the lamp attachment with practiced hands. "And after his death, you brought the watch to Edward Tiller because he was not only Philip's friend, but a master of precision mechanics in his own right. When I discovered the hidden compartment in the watch and realized what Philip had been investigating, I needed someone I could trust to help decode the information." She glanced at the timepiece on the table. Edward recognized the significance immediately. He began working to extract and interpret the data Philip had hidden. Holmes had finished preparing the apparatus and now opened the gold watch, exposing the inner cover with its train engraving. With delicate care, he positioned the magnifier and adjusted the small flame of the lamp to illuminate the engraving at precisely the right angle. "Remarkable," he breathed as he peered through the eyepiece. "Watson, you must see this." Watson took his turn at the apparatus, adjusting it slightly for his vision. Through the powerful lenses, the seemingly simple engraving of the train revealed itself as an intricate matrix of tiny lines and dots, an entire document reduced to microscopic scale and integrated into the decorative image. "It's extraordinary," Watson marveled. "I can make out words, numbers, coordinates, perhaps." Holmes reclaimed the magnifier, studying the micro-engraving with intense concentration. A list of naval vessels, deployment dates, and what appear to be the identification numbers of chronometers installed aboard them. And here, he adjusted the focus slightly, names, Admiralty officials who authorized the deployments. "Can you see who Philip suspected?" Mrs. Morwood asked, tension evident in her voice. Holmes continued his examination for several long moments before looking up, his expression grave. "He Several names appear with unusual frequency in connection with the compromised instruments, but one stands out. It appears to have been circled in the micro-engraving itself. He paused, glancing at Mrs. Morwood. Commander James Hargrove. The colour drained from her face. James? But he was Philip's superior, his mentor, even. They'd worked together for years. Often those closest to us are best positioned to betray, Holmes observed quietly. Did your husband ever mention any concerns about Commander Hargrove specifically? She shook her head slowly. Never. He spoke highly of James, admired him greatly. They dined at our home regularly. He was a friend. Holmes returned to the magnifier, studying the encoded information with methodical precision. According to these notes, Commander Hargrove personally approved the deployment of all the compromised chronometers. He also made regular inspections of the manufacturing facility where they were produced. He adjusted the lens again. And here, your husband noted that Hargrove made frequent trips to Dover, ostensibly to inspect the naval facilities there. The Dover train, Watson murmured, arriving at 2:17. Yes, Holmes agreed. And according to this, Hargrove was scheduled to make such a trip on the day after Tiller was killed. Mrs. Morwood's teacup clattered slightly as she set it down. Yesterday. James was in Dover yesterday. So it would appear, Holmes confirmed. And based on our observations at Charing Cross today, he likely returned on the 2:17 train, meeting with representatives of Continental Express Shipping. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional pop from the coal fire. Outside, the mist had thickened into a proper London fog, wreathing the buildings in spectral grey and muffling the sounds of passing carriages to ghostly whispers. "I still cannot believe it of James," Mrs. Morwood finally said, her voice barely audible. "He was at Philip's funeral. He held my hand and promised to find out what had happened. He said the boating accident seemed suspicious to him as well." The perfect cover, Holmes noted without inflection. Express concern, promise an investigation. Ensure it leads nowhere. He closed the watch carefully and placed it on the table. "Your husband discovered his betrayal, and it cost him his life. When you brought the watch to Tiller, you unknowingly set in motion the events that led to his death as well." She flinched at the blunt assessment. "I never meant—" "Of course you didn't," Watson interjected gently. "You sought justice for your husband, as anyone would." Holmes rose and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside to gaze down at Baker Street, now cloaked in fog. "The question that remains is how Hargrove learned of Tiller's involvement. Someone must have observed your visits to the shop or overheard your discussions." Merrick, who had been listening quietly until now, cleared his throat. "Mr. Holmes, I just remembered something that might be relevant. About 2 weeks ago, a naval officer came to the shop asking about the repair of a chronometer. He claimed the Admiralty was considering commissioning some specialized timepieces and wanted to assess Mr. Tiller's expertise." Holmes turned from the window. "Did he give his name?" "Lieutenant Fordham, I believe. Mr. Tiller seemed suspicious of him from the start, was unusually brusque in his manner. After the man left, Mr. Tiller checked all the locks and asked me if I'd mentioned his work on any special projects to anyone." Merrick frowned at the memory. "I hadn't, of course." "A reconnaissance," Holmes concluded. "Hargrove sent a subordinate to confirm his suspicions about Tiller's involvement." He returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. We must assume Hargrove now knows the watch was not found in Tiller's shop and will be looking for it. And for you, Mrs. Morwood. "What should we do?" she asked, her composure remarkably intact despite the revelations. Holmes considered for a moment. The evidence in this watch would be sufficient to prompt an official investigation into Commander Hargrove's activities, but only if presented to the right authorities. There is the matter of determining who within the Admiralty can be trusted. "My husband's former colleague, Admiral Sutton," Mrs. Morwood suggested. "Philip always said he was a man of absolute integrity. He's retired now, but still has considerable influence." "An excellent suggestion," Holmes agreed. "Watson and I shall call upon the Admiral first thing tomorrow. Until then, you and Mr. Merrick will remain here where it's safe." He turned to the apprentice. "You mentioned Mr. Tiller kept a map of the Channel coast. Did you happen to notice any markings on it?" Merrick nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir." He had circled several small coves and inlets, particularly along the Kent coast near Dover. "I remember thinking it odd, as they weren't places where shipping traffic would normally be. Heavy. Perfect locations for clandestine landings," Holmes observed. "Small boats from larger vessels standing offshore, perhaps." "There's something else in the watch engraving," Watson noted, who had taken another turn with the magnifier during their conversation. "What appears to be a schedule of some kind, dates and times, extending forward to—" He paused, adjusting the focus. "To the day after tomorrow. 2:17 a.m., at a place marked only as Lighthouse Cove." Mrs. Morwood sat forward. "There is a small bay called that near St. Margaret's, just northeast of Dover. Philip and I walked there once when visiting friends in the area. It's quite isolated, with high cliffs on either side." "And 2:17 in the morning would ensure darkness and minimal chance of witnesses," Holmes added. "I believe we may have identified the time and location of the next exchange of information, or perhaps Hargrove's planned escape, if he feels his position has been compromised." A clock somewhere in the house struck 9, the sound muffled by distance, but still a reminder of the late hour. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door to inquire if anything further was needed before she retired for the night. "All is well, Mrs. Hudson, thank you," Holmes assured her. "Our guests will be staying the night. Perhaps you could prepare the spare room for Mrs. Morwood, and Mr. Merrick can use the settee here if he doesn't mind." When the landlady had gone to make the arrangements, Holmes turned back to their discussion. "We should all try to rest. Tomorrow will require clear heads and steady nerves." Despite his own advice, Holmes remained awake long after the others had retired, seated in his armchair by the dying fire, the gold watch open in his palm. The firelight caught the engraving, making the tiny train seem to shimmer with potential movement, as if at any moment it might steam off the golden surface and into the world of the living. Time, Holmes reflected, was the central player in this drama, measured in the precision instruments that had been sabotaged, marked by the synchronized clocks in Tiller's shop, encoded in the watch that now rested in his hand. Time brought truth, eventually. The betrayal that had begun with tampered chronometers would be revealed by the very clockwork precision that the traitors had exploited. He must have dozed, for he awakened with a start at the sound of movement in the room. Pre-dawn light filtered weakly through the curtains, revealing Mrs. Morwood fully dressed and moving quietly toward the door. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Morwood?" he inquired mildly, causing her to freeze in her tracks. She turned slowly, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. I couldn't sleep. I thought perhaps some morning air. With your travelling case packed? Holmes nodded toward the small valise by her feet. And having removed the gold watch from the table where I left it? Her shoulders sagged in defeat. How long have you known? That you haven't been entirely truthful with us? Holmes rose from his chair, stretching stiff muscles. I had suspicions from our first meeting. Your story contained inconsistencies, small ones, but noticeable to someone who makes a study of details. She remained by the door, one hand still on the latch. The essential facts were true. Philip was murdered for what he discovered. Edward Tiller was killed because he was helping me. Yes, Holmes agreed, but you omitted certain crucial elements. Your relationship with Commander Hargrove, for instance. A flush rose in her cheeks. How could you possibly... Your reaction when I mentioned his name was revealing. Not just shock at his betrayal, but personal hurt. And you mentioned he held your hand at your husband's funeral, a gesture suggesting intimacy beyond professional sympathy. Holmes moved toward the fireplace, casually positioning himself between her and the door. I suspect your connection preceded your husband's death. For a long moment, she said nothing, her internal struggle visible in the tension of her posture. Then, like a marionette whose strings had been cut, she sank into the nearest chair. James and I, she began, then faltered. It began innocently enough. Philip was often away on Admiralty business. James would call to discuss work matters, then stay for tea. He was charming, attentive in ways Philip had not been for years. Her voice hardened slightly. I'm not proud of it, but neither will I pretend it meant nothing. And after your husband's death, Holmes prompted. James was distraught, or seemed to be. He blamed himself for assigning Philip to the project that took him out on that boat. A bitter smile crossed her lips. I comforted him, never suspecting he had arranged the accident himself. When did you begin to suspect his involvement? When I found the watch and decoded parts of Philip's notes. I recognized some of the dates James had visited our home. They coincided with dates Philip had marked as suspicious. Still, I couldn't believe it. She looked up at Holmes, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Not until yesterday, when you confirmed his name in Philip's records. Even then, part of me hoped there might be some explanation. So you planned to confront him? She nodded. The schedule in the watch, the meeting at Lighthouse Cove. I intended to be there, to hear from his own lips why he betrayed Philip, betrayed his country. Her hand moved to her pocket, where Holmes suspected she carried a small pistol. And perhaps to deliver the justice the law might not provide. Revenge rarely brings the satisfaction we imagine, Holmes observed quietly, and it would not restore what you have lost. What would you have me do? Hand the evidence to the Admiralty and hope they don't protect one of their own. James has powerful friends. Admiral Sutton being one of them, Holmes noted. Another detail you omitted. He isn't simply your husband's colleague. He's your uncle, is he not? Surprise registered briefly on her features. How did you... You suggested him too readily, with too much confidence in his integrity. A personal connection seemed likely. Holmes moved to the table and retrieved his pipe, filling it methodically from the Persian slipper where he kept his tobacco. You needn't fear a cover-up. I have certain connections of my own that will ensure the matter receives proper attention. The sky outside the windows had lightened to the pearl grey of early morning. From the street below came the clatter of the first delivery wagons and the calls of early vendors setting up their stalls. London awakening to another day, unaware of the drama unfolding in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street. "I believe you still have the watch," Holmes said, lighting his pipe with a spill from the fireplace. "I would appreciate its return." After a moment's hesitation, she reached into her pocket and produced the timepiece, holding it out to him without meeting his eyes. "Thank you." Holmes took it and returned to his chair. "Now, Mrs. Morwood, I suggest you unpack your valise and join us for breakfast when Mrs. Hudson brings it up. We have plans to make that will serve justice better than a solitary confrontation on a foggy shore." The tension gradually left her posture, replaced by a weariness born of emotional exhaustion. "You're right, of course. It was foolish to think I could handle this alone." "Grief and betrayal are powerful motivators," Holmes said, his tone softer now. "They can cloud the judgment of even the most rational minds." A gentle knock at the door announced Watson, already dressed and alert despite the early hour. He glanced between them, immediately sensing the charged atmosphere. "Everything all right?" "Perfectly," Holmes assured him. "Mrs. Morwood and I were just discussing the best approach to our meeting with Admiral Sutton." He did not look at her as he spoke, allowing her the dignity of privacy regarding their actual conversation. Watson nodded, accepting the explanation without question, one of the qualities Holmes most valued in his friend. "I've checked on young Merrick. His head is much improved, though he'll have quite a lump for a few days." "Excellent," Holmes responded, rising from his chair. "Once we've had breakfast, I believe a telegram to Inspector Lestrade is in order. We shall need the official arm of the law before this affair is concluded." As Mrs. Hudson arrived with a tray of breakfast, the aroma of fresh coffee and warm bread filling the room, the four conspirators gathered around the table, united once more in purpose, if not in complete trust. The gold watch lay at the center, its hands continuing their steady circuit, marking the inexorable passage of time toward resolution. Outside, the morning fog began to lift, revealing glimpses of blue sky above the chimney pots of Baker Street. A new day had begun, one that Holmes was determined bring an end to the betrayal that had claimed 2 lives and threatened more. The Clockmaker's final secret would soon be revealed in full, and with it, justice for those who had died in its keeping. Admiral Sutton's residence in Kensington stood as a testament to a life dedicated to naval service, stately but not ostentatious, with polished brass fixtures that gleamed like well-maintained ship's fittings and nautical touches that revealed the sea-going soul beneath the retired officer's civilian attire. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting warm rectangles of light across the Persian carpet in the study where Holmes, Watson, and Mrs. Morwood now sat awaiting the Admiral's assessment of the evidence they had brought. Admiral Sutton himself was a man whose appearance perfectly matched his surroundings, tall and straight-backed despite his 70 years, with a neatly trimmed white beard and eyes the faded blue of distant horizons. He had greeted his niece with genuine warmth, though concern had quickly overtaken his features when she explained the purpose of their visit. Now he sat behind his desk, the gold pocket watch open before him, carefully examining its micro-engraved secrets through Tiller's magnifying apparatus. The only sounds in the room were the gentle ticking of a ship's chronometer on the mantelpiece, a retirement gift from the Admiralty, Mrs. Morwood had whispered to Watson, and the occasional soft exhalation from the Admiral as he discovered yet another damning piece of evidence against a man he had considered a protégé. "Hargrove," he finally murmured, sitting back in his chair and removing the magnifying glass from his eye. "I recommended him for promotion myself, not 2 years ago." He shook his head slowly, the movement containing equal parts disbelief and resignation. "One hopes to be a better judge of character after 4 decades of naval service." "The most skilled deceivers, Admiral, are those who show us precisely what we most wish to see in them," Holmes observed. Commander Hargrove presented himself as the model naval officer, dedicated to the king and country. That his true loyalties lay elsewhere would be carefully concealed, especially from those whose good opinion mattered most to his advancement. The Admiral nodded grimly, his weathered hand resting on the watch. "These records are meticulous. Philip always was thorough in his work." He glanced at his niece, his expression softening momentarily. "He was right to be suspicious, Margaret, and very brave to pursue the matter as he did." Mrs. Morwood sat with perfect composure, though Watson, seated beside her, noticed the slight tremor in her clasped hands, the only outward sign of her inner turmoil. The morning light caught the single pearl at her throat, seemingly the sole point of brightness in her morning attire. "What is to be done, uncle?" she asked quietly. "Mr. Holmes believes Hargrove may be planning to flee the country tomorrow night." Admiral Sutton's expression hardened into the commanding mien that had likely struck fear into countless midshipmen during his years of active service. "He will not escape justice, I assure you. This evidence is more than sufficient to have him arrested immediately." He rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the carefully tended garden beyond. "However, there may be value in allowing him a bit more rope with which to hang himself, and perhaps reveal his foreign contacts in the process." Holmes, who had been silent during much of the exchange, nodded approvingly. "Precisely my thinking, Admiral. If Hargrove believes his treachery remains undetected, he will likely proceed with the meeting at Lighthouse Cove tomorrow night. With proper preparation, we might apprehend not only the commander, but also those to whom he has been selling your naval secrets." "A trap," the Admiral agreed, turning back to face them. "But it will require careful coordination. Lighthouse Cove is isolated, accessible primarily by water. We would need a naval vessel, operating under absolute secrecy." "Do you have such authority?" Holmes inquired. A smile ghosted across the Admiral's features. "In retirement, one cultivates different sorts of influence, Mr. Holmes. I count the current First Sea Lord among my oldest friends. A telegram from me would secure whatever resources we require, with the utmost discretion." "Excellent," Holmes responded. "Then I suggest the following approach. You will contact your friend at the Admiralty to arrange for a suitable vessel to be positioned near Lighthouse Cove tomorrow night. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard will accompany us with several trusted officers to make the arrests once the exchange has been witnessed. In the meantime, we must ensure that nothing alerts Hargrove to our knowledge of his activities." The Admiral nodded agreement. "I shall make the arrangements immediately." He moved to a small writing desk near the window and began drafting a telegram, his pen moving with the precise efficiency of a man accustomed to command. Mrs. Morwood leaned slightly toward Holmes. "What of Thomas Merrick? Will he be safe at Baker Street?" "Perfectly safe," Holmes assured her. Mrs. Hudson has strict instructions not to admit any visitors, and the young man has shown admirable good sense in agreeing to remain indoors. Additionally, I have arranged for one of the Baker Street irregulars to keep watch on the street and alert us to any suspicious persons in the vicinity. The mention of the irregulars, Holmes's network of street urchins who served as his eyes and ears throughout London, brought a slight smile to Watson's face. The resourcefulness of those ragged boys had proven invaluable on countless occasions, their ability to move unnoticed through the city's thoroughfares a perfect complement to Holmes's more orthodox investigative methods. Admiral Sutton completed his telegram and rang for a servant to have it dispatched immediately. "That should set things in motion," he stated, returning to his desk. "Now, Mr. Holmes, I believe we should discuss the specific tactical approach to tomorrow night's operation. My naval experience may be of some use in planning." For the next hour, the four conspirators bent over charts of the Dover coastline that the Admiral produced from his extensive library. The cove itself, Holmes noted, was indeed perfectly suited to clandestine meetings. A small, sheltered bay, with high cliffs on either side, accessible by a narrow path down from the coastal road, or directly by boat. The lighthouse that gave the cove its name stood on the eastern headland, its beam sweeping out to sea rather than illuminating the protected waters below. "The moon will be just past the first quarter tomorrow night," the Admiral observed, consulting an almanac. "Limited illumination, but not complete darkness. The tide will be rising at 2 o'clock, making the approach by boat relatively straightforward. Hargrove will likely arrive by land," Holmes reasoned, tracing the coastal path with his finger. "Probably hiring a trap from Dover to bring him to the nearest accessible point, then proceeding on foot to the rendezvous. His contacts, coming from the continent, would approach by sea. A small boat from a larger vessel standing offshore, perhaps. The naval patrol vessel could remain out of sight around this headland," the Admiral suggested, indicating a point on the chart. "Close enough to move in quickly once the exchange is observed, but not visible from the cove itself." Holmes nodded approval. "Watson and I, along with Inspector Lestrade and perhaps one other officer, would position ourselves here, on the western cliff. It offers a clear view of the cove while providing adequate cover." "And myself?" Mrs. Morwood inquired. "Where would I be positioned?" A momentary silence fell over the room. Holmes and Watson exchanged glances, while the Admiral's bushy eyebrows drew together in concern. "My dear Margaret," the Admiral began gently, "surely you don't intend to be present for the apprehension itself? It could be dangerous, and your presence might—" "I have already been in danger since the moment I found Philip's watch," she interrupted, her voice level but firm. "2 men have died because of what that watch contains. I will see this through to its conclusion." Watson observed the subtle shift in Holmes's expression, a fleeting acknowledgement of respect for the woman's determination, quickly masked by practical considerations. Mrs. Morwood's presence might actually prove advantageous, Holmes mused, surprising the others. Hargrove believes she possesses the watch, but does not know that she has decoded its contents or connected him to her husband's death. If she were to contact him, suggesting a meeting— "You wish to use my niece as bait?" the Admiral asked, his voice sharp with disapproval. "Not at all," Holmes assured him smoothly. "Rather, as a means of confirming Hargrove's intentions." A note from Mrs. Morwood implying that she has recently discovered something in her husband's effects that she wishes to discuss with him, might prompt Hargrove to reveal his hand in some way. His response, or lack thereof, would be informative. Mrs. Morwood straightened in her chair. I am willing to do it. As Mr. Holmes suggests, a carefully worded message need not place me in any additional danger. The Admiral studied his niece's face for a long moment before reluctantly nodding. Very well, but I insist that any such communication be drafted with the utmost caution, and that Margaret remain well away from any potential confrontation. Naturally, Holmes agreed. Mrs. Morwood's safety is paramount. With the general outline of their plan established, the Admiral invited them to take luncheon, during which the conversation turned to more general topics. Watson found himself engaged in a fascinating discussion of naval medicine with their host, while Holmes and Mrs. Morwood spoke quietly about the technical aspects of chronometer design. It was, Watson reflected, a strangely normal interlude in what had become an extraordinary sequence of events. A reminder that even in the midst of intrigue and danger, the civilized rhythms of life continued. After lunch, as they prepared to depart, the Admiral drew his niece into a brief, fierce embrace. Your father would be proud of your courage, he told her softly. As am I. She returned the embrace, her composure faltering momentarily. Thank you, Uncle, for everything. The afternoon sun had taken on the golden quality particular to autumn days as they emerged from the Admiral's house. The streets of Kensington were alive with the usual activities of a weekday. Nannies pushing perambulators through the park, delivery boys on their rounds, gentlemen and ladies going about their business with the purposeful air of those secure in their place in the world. How strange, Watson thought, that none of them knew of the treachery and danger that had occupied their morning's discussion, the invisible currents of espionage and betrayal flowing beneath the placid surface of everyday life. Holmes hailed a hansom cab to return them to Baker Street, where they found Thomas Merrick engaged in an animated conversation with Mrs. Hudson about the mechanics of her kitchen clock, which apparently had developed a slight irregularity in its tick. The young apprentice looked up with evident relief as they entered. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I was beginning to worry when the hours passed with no word. All is proceeding as it should, Holmes assured him, hanging his hat on the rack. Has there been any disturbance here during our absence? None at all, sir, though one of the street boys came by with a message about an hour ago. Merrick produced a folded scrap of paper from his pocket. He said it was important. Holmes took the paper and unfolded it, reading the cramped handwriting with a slight frown. Interesting. Wiggins reports that a naval officer has been observed making inquiries at several watchmakers' shops in Soho this morning. The description matches Lieutenant Fordham, whom you mentioned yesterday. Hargrove's subordinate, Watson noted. Still searching for the watch, it seems. Indeed, which suggests that Hargrove remains unaware of our involvement and is pursuing his own lines of investigation. Holmes tapped the paper thoughtfully against his palm. This may work to our advantage. Mrs. Morwood had moved to the window, gazing down at Baker Street with a distant expression. I should compose that note to James now, while there's still time for him to receive it today. Holmes nodded agreement and provided her with writing materials from his desk. As she sat to draft the message, he turned to Watson and Merrick. We should pay a visit to Scotland Yard this afternoon to brief Inspector Lestrade. Mr. Merrick, I'm afraid we must ask you to remain here once more. Your safety is still a concern, and your knowledge of the case makes you a valuable witness." The young man nodded, though Watson detected a hint of disappointment in his expression. "I understand, sir, though I wish I could be of more active assistance." "Your time will come," Holmes assured him. "And when this affair is concluded, I have no doubt your skills as a clockmaker will be much in demand. The shop will need a new proprietor, after all." Merrick's eyes widened at the implication. "You think I might? But I'm only an apprentice." "An apprentice who has already demonstrated considerable talent and resourcefulness," Holmes observed, "qualities that would serve you well as Mr. Tiller's successor." The young man's face flushed with pleasure at the unexpected praise. "Thank you, sir. I would be honoured to continue Mr. Tiller's work." Mrs. Morwood completed her letter and sealed it in an envelope, addressing it to Commander Hargrove at the Admiralty. "It's done," she announced, handing it to Holmes for his inspection. "I've suggested that I recently found some of Philip's papers that confuse me, and asked if he might call on me tomorrow to help make sense of them." Holmes scanned the note with approval. "Excellently done. Just the right tone of innocent inquiry. This should prompt Hargrove to make contact, if only to assess how much you actually know." The letter was dispatched with one of the Baker Street irregulars, a sharp-eyed lad named Billy, who Holmes instructed to deliver it directly to the Admiralty building, and observe, if possible, the recipient's reaction upon receiving it. With that task completed, Holmes and Watson set out for Scotland Yard, leaving Mrs. Morwood and Merrick in the capable care of Mrs. Hudson, who had promised to prepare a substantial tea for the household later in the afternoon. The offices of Scotland Yard presented their usual scene of organised chaos. Constables coming and going, clerks filing, reports, and the general buzz of London's primary police force conducting its daily business. Inspector Lestrade received them in his small office, where the perpetually harried detective's appearance suggested he had been dealing with particularly vexing cases that day. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted them, clearing space on the visitors' chairs by moving stacks of paperwork to his already overburdened desk. "I was wondering when you might appear. Any progress on the clockmaker's murder?" "Considerable progress," Holmes replied, settling into the offered chair. "In fact, we are now in a position to identify not only Tiller's killer, but also those responsible for the death of Philip Morwood 3 years ago, what was officially recorded as a boating accident." Lestrade's eyebrows rose in surprise. 2 cases at once. "Well, that would be a welcome resolution. The Commissioner has been asking for updates on the Tiller case daily. Apparently, the victim had connections in higher circles than one might expect of a Soho clockmaker." "Higher circles indeed," Holmes agreed, "including the Admiralty, where the true centre of this web of intrigue lies." For the next half hour, Holmes laid out the essential facts of the case: the sabotaged chronometers, Philip Morwood's secret documentation, Tiller's role in decoding the evidence, and Commander Hargrove's treachery. He concluded with their plan to apprehend the traitor and his foreign contacts at Lighthouse Cove the following night. Lestrade listened with increasing amazement, occasionally jotting notes in his battered notebook. When Holmes finished, the inspector let out a low whistle. Naval espionage, murdered clockmakers, secret messages in pocket watches. It sounds more like one of Dr. Watson's stories than a real police matter. He shook his head wonderingly. But if what you say is true, this Commander Hargrove has committed high treason. Precisely, Holmes confirmed, which is why we require your assistance. Admiral Sutton is arranging for a naval vessel to be positioned near the cove, but we need trusted officers from the yard to make the actual arrests once the evidence of treasonous activities has been witnessed. Lestrade nodded firmly. You shall have them. I'll lead the party myself, with Gregson and Jones. They're both solid men who can keep a secret when needed. He began making further notes. We'll need to coordinate transportation to Dover tomorrow, and then to Lighthouse Cove. As Lestrade worked through the logistics, Watson found his mind drifting to the human aspects of the case, the tangled relationships that had led to this point. Philip Morwood, dedicated engineer, betrayed by his mentor and his wife. Edward Tiller, clockmaker and loyal friend, murdered for helping a widow seek justice. Margaret Morwood, caught between grief, guilt, and a determination to see the truth revealed. And at the centre, Commander Hargrove, whose betrayal extended beyond national secrets to the most intimate bonds of trust. The unwinding of these relationships reminded Watson of the spring, in a clock gradually losing tension, the mechanism that had once kept everything in precise alignment, slowly releasing its energy until the entire system faltered and stopped. Tomorrow night at Lighthouse Cove, they would witness the final unwinding of Hargrove's carefully constructed deception. Their business at Scotland Yard concluded, Holmes and Watson emerged once more into the late afternoon sunlight. The day had begun to wane, the golden quality of earlier hours deepening toward the amber hues that precede twilight. London's pace had shifted as well, the purposeful bustle of the working day giving way to the more leisurely movements of people heading homeward or seeking evening entertainment. I believe we have done all we can for today, Holmes remarked as they walked along the embankment, the Thames flowing beside them in smooth, dark currents that reflected the gradually changing sky. The pieces are in position. Now we must wait for Hargrove's response to Mrs. Morwood's letter. Do you think he'll contact her? Watson asked. Almost certainly. He cannot afford to ignore such a communication. The risk that she might have discovered something incriminating is too great. Holmes paused to light his pipe, the match flaring briefly in the gathering dusk. Whether he attempts to meet with her as she suggested, or takes more direct action, remains to be seen. They continued their walk in companionable silence, each absorbed in his own thoughts, as the city around them prepared for evening. Gas lamps were being lit along the thoroughfares, their warm glow creating pools of light in the deepening shadows. From the river came the mournful call of a steamer's whistle, echoing beneath the bridges that spanned the ancient waterway. It occurs to me, Holmes, Watson finally said, that this entire affair has revolved around the measurement of time. Naval chronometers to fix position at sea, railway timetables marking the Dover train's arrival, clocks stopped at the moment of Tiller's murder, a pocket watch containing secrets revealed only when viewed through the proper lens. He glanced at his friend. There's a certain poetry to it, don't you think? Holmes's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the nearest he typically came to a smile when engaged in a case. I leave the poetry to you, Watson. But yes, the temporal elements are striking. Time reveals all truths eventually, they say. In this instance, it has taken 3 years for Philip Morwood's murder to be recognized as such, and only days for Edward Tiller's killer to be identified. He drew thoughtfully on his pipe. By this time tomorrow, If all goes as planned, justice will have caught up with Commander Hargrove as well. As they approached Baker Street, the evening had fully settled over London. Stars were beginning to appear in the clear autumn sky, those few visible, through the city's ever-present veil of smoke and fog. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, not unpleasant, but charged with the potential energy of events yet to unfold. In 221 Boom, they found Mrs. Hudson true to her word. A substantial tea had been laid out, which Thomas Merrick was already enjoying with the hearty appetite of youth. Mrs. Morwood sat nearby, her face showing signs of fatigue, but also a calm determination that had replaced the tension of earlier hours. "Any word from our messenger?" Holmes inquired, hanging his hat and coat. "Young Billy returned about an hour ago," Mrs. Morwood replied. "He said the letter was delivered directly to Commander Hargrove's office at the Admiralty. The clerk who accepted it promised immediate delivery." Holmes nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent. Now we wait for a response, which I expect will come either this evening or early tomorrow." As they gathered around the table, sharing the simple meal and quiet conversation, Watson was struck by the unusual domesticity of the scene, this temporary family united by circumstance and common purpose. Outside, London continued its eternal rhythms, oblivious to the drama playing out within these walls, and the confrontation that awaited them the following night on a distant shore. The gold pocket watch lay on the mantelpiece where Holmes had placed it earlier, its steady tick marking each passing moment with mechanical precision. Time, measurer of life, revealer of truths, and ultimately the impartial witness to both justice and betrayal. Morning arrived in London with the soft persistence of autumn sunlight filtering through lingering mist, gradually illuminating the city as it stirred to life. At Baker Street, the household had risen early, a sense of quiet anticipation permeating the familiar rooms as preparations for the evening's expedition to Lighthouse Cove continued. Holmes, who appeared to have slept little, if at all, sat at his desk surrounded by maritime charts, railway timetables, and telegrams that had arrived in the early hours from Admiral Sutton. Watson found his friend thus engaged when he descended from his bedroom, already dressed and ready for whatever the day might bring. "Ah, Watson," Holmes greeted him without looking up from his work. "I trust you slept well? We have a busy day ahead, and a rather more demanding night to follow." "Well enough," Watson replied, pouring himself a cup of the coffee that Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully provided. "Any word from Hargrove?" Holmes gestured to an envelope lying beside the charts. This arrived by messenger just after dawn, a response to Mrs. Morwood's letter, requesting that she meet him at his club this afternoon at 3 o'clock to discuss her husband's papers. Watson picked up the letter and examined it. The handwriting was precise and controlled, the paper of excellent quality, the message itself brief and seemingly innocuous. He suspects nothing, then? On the contrary, Holmes replied, finally looking up from his charts. He suspects a great deal, but believes he can manage the situation. Note the choice of location. His club, where she would be at a social disadvantage as a woman in a gentleman's domain, and where any display of emotion on her part would be deemed inappropriate. He seeks to control the encounter from the outset. Mrs. Morwood entered the room at that moment, having evidently overheard the conversation. "I have no intention of meeting him," she stated calmly, but his response confirms that he will be proceeding with his plans for tonight. Does it not? If he believed I posed an immediate threat, he would take more direct action. Holmes nodded approvingly. Precisely my assessment. By suggesting this meeting, he hopes to determine how much you know while maintaining the appearance of proper concern for a colleague's widow. When you fail to appear, he will likely assume you simply had second thoughts, or were detained by some mundane matter. Thomas Merrick, who had spent the night on Holmes's settee, joined them from the bathroom where he had been attending to his morning ablutions. The young apprentice looked considerably recovered from his ordeal, the swelling on his temple reduced to a faint discoloration that would soon fade entirely. "What happens now, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, accepting a cup of coffee from Watson with a grateful nod. "Now," Holmes replied, "we finalize our preparations for tonight's excursion. Inspector Lestrade will be joining us shortly to coordinate the police involvement, and we expect further communication from Admiral Sutton regarding the naval vessel that will intercept any boat approaching from the continent." The morning progressed with methodical efficiency. Lestrade arrived around 10 o'clock, bringing news that transportation had been arranged. A private carriage would convey them to Dover, departing London at noon to allow ample time for positioning themselves before nightfall. The inspector had selected 2 of his most trusted sergeants to accompany them, men who combined physical capability with the discretion necessary for such a sensitive operation. "They'll meet us at Victoria Station," Lestrade explained, accepting the tea Mrs. Hudson had prepared. "Plain clothes, of course. As far as anyone at the yard knows, I'm investigating a smuggling operation on the Kent coast, which is not entirely untrue, considering the circumstances." Holmes nodded approval. "Excellent, Lestrade. And your men are armed, I presume?" "Standard issue revolvers," the inspector confirmed, "though I hope we won't need to use them. Naval secrets or not, I'd prefer to bring Hargrove and his contacts alive to stand trial." As they discussed final details, a telegram arrived from Admiral Sutton. Holmes read it quickly, his expression revealing satisfaction with its contents. "The Admiral has secured a patrol vessel, HMS Vigilant, which will position itself beyond the headland near Lighthouse, Cove by nightfall. The captain is a trusted colleague of the Admiral's, fully briefed on the sensitive nature of the operation." "So all is in readiness," Watson observed, mentally reviewing his own preparations. His service revolver cleaned and loaded, a warm coat for the night watch on the cliffs, and a small medical kit should his professional services be required. "Nearly so," Holmes agreed. "There is, however, one final matter to address." He turned to Mrs. Morwood, his expression grave. "Madam, I must insist that you remain here in London." She straightened, an immediate protest visible in her posture. "Mr. Holmes, we have already discussed this. I have every right to be present when my husband's killer is brought to justice." "Indeed you do," Holmes acknowledged. "However, circumstances have changed. Hargrove's letter suggests he is more suspicious than we initially believed. If you fail to appear at his club this afternoon, he may take additional precautions tonight, perhaps even abandon the meeting entirely." "Then I shall keep the appointment," she countered. "I can maintain the pretense for a few hours." Holmes shook his head firmly. "Too risky. Hargrove knows you well enough to detect any subterfuge. Your emotional connection to this case would make deception extraordinarily difficult, even for someone with considerable acting ability." Watson watched the internal struggle play out across Mrs. Morwood's features, the desire for justice warring with the logical force of Holmes's argument. Finally she sighed, a sound of reluctant acceptance. "What do you propose instead?" "That you send a note to Hargrove's club," Holmes replied, "explaining that you have been called unexpectedly to attend a sick relative in Sussex and must postpone your meeting. This provides a plausible reason for your absence, while giving him no cause for immediate alarm." After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. I bow to your judgment in this matter." With that final detail settled, preparations continued apace. Mrs. Morwood drafted her note to Hargrove, which was dispatched by one of the irregulars with instructions to deliver it to the club's doorman precisely at 2:30, 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting. Merrick, who would also remain in London under Mrs. Hudson's watchful eye, helped Holmes pack specific equipment for the night's surveillance. Powerful field glasses, dark lanterns with shutters to control the light, and signalling equipment to communicate with the naval vessel offshore. Shortly before noon, a hackney arrived to transport Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade to Victoria Station, where they would meet the inspector's sergeants and board the train to Dover. As they prepared to depart, Mrs. Morwood approached Watson, speaking quietly, while Holmes gave final instructions to Merrick. "Take care of them, Doctor," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying deeper emotion. "And yourself as well. I have lost enough people to this affair already." "We will exercise every caution," Watson assured her, touched by her concern. "Holmes knows what he's doing, and with the police and navy in support, the odds are very much in our favour." She smiled faintly, though the expression did not reach her eyes. Philip used to say that in navigation it is not the wide sea that poses the greatest danger, but the final approach to shore. Be watchful tonight, especially when you believe the danger has passed. With those cryptic words of caution, she stepped back, composing herself once more into the picture of dignified restraint. Holmes rejoined them, and after brief farewells, the three men departed for Victoria Station and the journey that awaited. The train ride to Dover passed pleasantly enough, the autumn countryside slipping by in a kaleidoscope of russet, amber, and fading green as they travelled southeast toward the coast. Lestrade's sergeants, Barton and Collins, proved to be exactly as the inspector had described them. Capable, attentive men who asked intelligent questions about the operation while maintaining the professional detachment necessary for such work. Holmes spent much of the journey in silent contemplation, gazing out at the passing landscape with the abstracted expression Watson knew so well. The detective's remarkable mind sorting through possibilities, anticipating complications, planning countermoves in the complex game they were playing. Only occasionally did he interject a comment or question into the conversation, each contribution demonstrating that despite his apparent detachment, he was fully aware of every detail being discussed. They arrived in Dover shortly after 3 o'clock, the afternoon sun hanging low over the harbour, glinting off the channel waters that stretched toward the distant coast of France. The famous white cliffs rose majestically along the shoreline, their chalk faces luminous in the autumn light. "We have several hours before we need to position ourselves at Lighthouse Cove," Holmes observed as they disembarked. "I suggest we secure rooms at the Lord Warden Hotel near the harbour, where we can review our final preparations in comfort and obtain an early supper before setting out." The hotel, a handsome establishment favoured by travellers awaiting Channel steamers, provided them with adjoining rooms overlooking the busy harbour. Ships of various sizes moved in and out of the port, fishing vessels returning with the day's catch, commercial steamers preparing for the crossing to Calais, and in the distance the sleek profile of what Watson recognised as a Royal Navy patrol ship, likely the HMS Vigilant that Admiral Sutton had arranged for their operation. In the privacy of Holmes's room, the 5 men gathered around a table where Lestrade spread out detailed maps of the coastline northeast of Dover, focusing on the area surrounding Lighthouse Cove. The cove itself is here, Holmes indicated, his finger tracing the small indentation in the coastline, accessible by a path that descends from the cliff road above, a steep descent of perhaps 200 feet. The lighthouse stands on this eastern promontory, its beam directed out to sea rather than into the cove itself. Which means the cove will be in relative darkness, Sergeant Barton noted, studying the map with professional interest. Ideal for clandestine meetings. Precisely, Holmes agreed. We will position ourselves here, on the western headland, which offers clear views of the cove while providing adequate cover among the gorse and bracken. The naval vessel will remain out of sight beyond this eastern point until our signal. Lestrade nodded, visualizing the arrangement. And you expect Hargrove to arrive from the Dover direction, along the cliff road? Most likely. He would hire a trap or dog cart from Dover to bring him to the point where the path descends to the cove, then continue on foot. His continental contacts would approach by boat, a small craft launched from a larger vessel standing offshore. Timing is critical, Watson observed. The rendezvous is set for 2:17 in the morning, according to the pocket watch's information. We should be in position well before then. Holmes consulted his own watch. I propose we have an early supper at 6, then rest for a few hours before departing at 10 o'clock. The journey to Lighthouse Cove will take approximately 1 hour by carriage, giving us ample time to position ourselves and become familiar with the terrain before Hargrove's expected arrival. The plan thus established, they dispersed briefly to freshen up before reconvening in the hotel's dining room, where a hearty meal of Dover sole, roast potatoes, and seasonal vegetables fortified them for the night ahead. Conversation over supper was deliberately light, Lestrade recounting amusing anecdotes from his early days at Scotland Yard, Watson describing some of the more peculiar but benign medical cases he had encountered in his practice, and even Holmes, unbending enough to share observations about the various travellers visible in the dining room, deducing their professions and destinations from subtle clues in their appearance and behaviour. This pleasant interlude served to ease the tension that naturally preceded such an operation, allowing them to approach the coming confrontation with calm focus rather than nervous anticipation. By the time they retired to their rooms for a few hours of rest, a sense of quiet confidence had settled over the group, each man aware of his role in the night's proceedings and the significance of what they hoped to accomplish. Watson managed a light doze, though true sleep eluded him. At 9:30 he rose and prepared himself for the night's work, donning warm clothing against the coastal chill, checking his revolver one final time and ensuring his medical bag contained everything that might be needed in case of emergency. A gentle knock at his door announced Holmes, similarly attired for the night watch, his lean face set in lines of concentration. "Ready, Watson?" The others are assembling in the lobby. Quite ready, Watson confirmed, collecting his coat and hat. Though I confess a certain eagerness to have this business concluded. Holmes's eyes gleamed with understanding in the lamplight. The waiting is often the hardest part. But tonight, my friend, we shall bring this particular mechanism to its proper conclusion, every gear and spring functioning as intended to reveal the truth. The carriage Lestrade had arranged, a sturdy vehicle with a discreet driver who asked no questions about their unusual destination or hour of travel, conveyed them along the coast road northeast from Dover. The night had turned clear and cold, stars brilliant in the vault of darkness overhead, the quarter moon casting just enough light to silhouette the dramatic coastline against the darker sea beyond. They travelled in companionable silence, each man absorbed in his own thoughts as the carriage wheels hummed against the coastal road. The occasional glimpse of the Channel appeared to their right, a vast, dark expanse, punctuated by the distant lights of ships passing in the night, some bound for English ports, others making their way toward continental harbours. After approximately 50 minutes of travel, Holmes tapped on the roof of the carriage. "The next bend, driver. You may let us down there." The vehicle slowed and came to a halt at a point where the road curved inland slightly. To their right, the land fell away toward the sea, the moonlight revealing the faint outline of a path descending the cliff face. "This is our position," Holmes confirmed, consulting a small pocket compass. Lighthouse Cove lies directly below, with the lighthouse itself visible on the far headland. Indeed, the revolving beam of the lighthouse could be seen sweeping outward toward the channel, creating momentary flashes across the dark waters, but leaving the cove itself in shadow. The 5 men disembarked, Lestrade instructing the driver to wait at an inn 2 miles back along the road until summoned. "We'll proceed on foot from here," Holmes directed, leading the way toward the cliff edge. "Step carefully. The path is narrow and poorly maintained." The descent proved challenging in the darkness, requiring full concentration as they picked their way down the steep, winding trail. Loose stones occasionally skittered from beneath their feet, clattering down the incline and reminding them of the drop that awaited any misstep. Watson found himself grateful for the sturdy walking stick he had brought, using it to test the ground ahead and maintain his balance on the treacherous path. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they reached a point approximately halfway down the cliff where the path traversed horizontally along the face, before continuing its descent to the cove. Here, Holmes called a halt. "This position serves our purposes perfectly," he observed in a low voice. "We have clear views of both the cove below and the remainder of the path. Anyone approaching from above or by boat will be visible, while we remain concealed among these rock formations." The men arranged themselves accordingly, finding positions that offered both observation advantages and some protection from the chill breeze that swept in from the channel. Sergeant Collins distributed vacuum flasks of hot coffee from his pack, a thoughtful provision that Watson gratefully acknowledged as the cold began to seep through even his warm clothing. Now began the hardest part of any surveillance, the waiting. The moon continued its arc across the sky. The lighthouse beam swept its regular pattern out to sea, and the minutes ticked by with the agonizing slowness particular to nocturnal vigils. Conversation was minimal and conducted in whispers, with each man taking turns to scan their surroundings through the field glasses Holmes had provided. Shortly after midnight, Sergeant Barton, who was watching the cliff path above them, stiffened slightly. "Movement on the road," he murmured, passing the glasses to Holmes. "A vehicle approaching from the Dover direction." Holmes studied the distant road carefully. "A dog cart," he confirmed. "Single passenger besides the driver. They're stopping at the head of the path." All 5 men focused their attention on the cliff top, where a dark figure could now be discerned descending from the vehicle. After a brief exchange with the driver, the figure began making its way down the path toward the cove. "Hargrove," Holmes breathed, observing the approaching figure through the glasses. "Moving with the confidence of someone who has made this descent before. Note how he navigates without hesitation, even in this limited light." They pressed themselves deeper into the shadows of the rock formation as the naval officer drew nearer. When Hargrove passed their position on the path below them, Watson caught a glimpse of his profile in the faint moonlight. A handsome, aristocratic face, set in lines of determination, giving no outward indication of the treachery that had led him to this clandestine meeting. Once Hargrove had continued his descent toward the cove, Lestrade turned to Holmes with a questioning look. "Do we follow him down?" Holmes shook his head slightly. "Not yet. We wait for his contacts to arrive. The evidence must be incontrovertible. Hargrove in the act of exchanging information with foreign agents." The minutes ticked by, the only sounds being the distant crash of waves against the base of the cliffs and the periodic cry of a night bird somewhere along the coastline. Hargrove had reached the cove and now stood near the water's edge, occasionally checking his pocket watch by the faint moonlight that filtered down to the protected bay. "There," Watson whispered suddenly, pointing out to sea. "A boat." Through the field glasses, they could make out a small craft approaching the cove, a rowing boat with 2 figures at the oars and a third seated in the stern. It moved with practiced precision, the oarsman maintaining a steady rhythm that brought it smoothly toward the shore where Hargrove waited. Holmes extracted a small electric torch from his coat and directed 3 brief flashes out to sea, not toward the approaching boat, but at an angle toward the eastern headland, where HMS Vigilant waited out of sight. 3 answering flashes confirmed the signal had been received and understood. The naval vessel was alert and moving into position. "Now we wait for the exchange to occur," Holmes murmured. "Once the information changes hands, we move in." The rowing boat reached the shore, its keel grinding softly against the shingle beach of the cove. The figure in the stern disembarked, a tall man in a heavy coat, carrying what appeared to be a leather dispatch case. The oarsman remained with the boat, ready for a quick departure. Through the field glasses, Watson observed the meeting between Hargrove and the newcomer. A brief handshake, followed by a conversation conducted in low tones that didn't carry up to their observation point. Then Hargrove reached inside his coat and produced a small packet, which he handed to the foreign agent. In return, the tall man opened his dispatch case and removed what looked like a thick envelope, passing it to the naval officer. "Now," Holmes directed, rising from their concealment, "the exchange has been made." The 5 men began moving swiftly down the remaining section of path toward the cove, trying to balance speed with stealth. They had covered perhaps half the distance when a shout from below indicated they had been spotted. The foreign agent immediately bolted toward the waiting boat, while Hargrove hesitated momentarily before turning to flee along the shoreline toward a narrow gap in the cliffs that presumably led to another exit from the cove. "Lestrade, you and your men secure the boat and the foreign agents," Holmes called. "Watson and I will pursue Hargrove." The detective and the doctor changed direction, scrambling down the last portion of the cliff path and then sprinting across the shingle beach toward the gap where Hargrove had disappeared. Behind them, they could hear Lestrade and his sergeants shouting police warnings to the men in the boat, while from around the eastern headland came the sound of a steam engine as HMS Vigilant moved into position to cut off any escape by sea. The gap in the cliffs proved to be the entrance to a narrow ravine that wound upward through the chalk formations. A smuggler's path, Watson realized, used for centuries by those bringing contraband goods ashore along this secretive coastline. Though the footing was treacherous, loose stones and gravel shifting beneath their boots as they pursued the fleeing naval officer. Holmes, with his longer legs and exceptional physical conditioning, began to pull ahead of Watson in the chase. "He's tiring, Watson," the detective called back. "We're gaining on him." Indeed, Hargrove's figure was now visible perhaps 50 yards ahead, his progress slowed by the steep incline and difficult terrain. The moonlight, stronger now that they were emerging from the narrow ravine, revealed the naval officer's laboured movements as he struggled upward. Suddenly, Hargrove stopped and turned to face his pursuers. The moonlight glinted off metal in his hand, a revolver levelled directly at Holmes. "That's far enough, Mr. Holmes," he called, his voice remarkably steady despite his exertion. "I know who you are, though I confess I'm surprised to find you here. Margaret must have been more resourceful than I gave her credit for." Holmes halted, motioning for Watson to do the same. "It's over, Hargrove," he replied calmly. "The cove is surrounded, your contacts are being taken into custody, and the evidence of your treason is substantial. Surrender now, and you may at least avoid the harshest penalty for your crimes." A bitter laugh escaped the naval officer. "Always so logical, aren't you? Philip was the same way, believing that facts and evidence would inevitably lead to truth. He never understood that the world operates on power and connection, not abstract principles." "Is that how you justified betraying him?" Watson asked, unable to contain his disgust. "A man who trusted you as both colleague and friend." Hargrove's expression hardened. "Philip was a fool. He would have sacrificed valuable advantages for England in the name of his precious ethical standards. Sometimes, Doctor, the greater good requires certain compromises." "Such as murder?" Holmes inquired, his tone conversational despite the revolver still pointed in his direction. "First Philip Morwood, then Edward Tiller, both killed to protect your arrangement with Prussian intelligence." "Regrettable necessities," Hargrove acknowledged, without apparent remorse. "As this is now." His finger tightened on the trigger. In that instant, a sharp crack echoed through the ravine, but it came not from Hargrove's weapon. The naval officer jerked backward, his own shot going wild as he collapsed to the ground. Watson immediately rushed forward, medical instincts overriding caution. Hargrove lay on the rocky ground, blood spreading across his uniform jacket from a wound in his shoulder. His revolver had fallen from his grasp, and now lay several feet away. Standing above him, emerging from the shadows of a rock, outcropping higher up the path, was a figure Holmes and Watson recognized immediately. Mrs. Morwood, Holmes breathed, genuine surprise evident in his voice. "You were instructed to remain in London." Margaret Morwood descended toward them, a small pistol still gripped in her steady hand. "I could not remain behind, Mr. Holmes, not when justice for Philip was finally within reach." She glanced down at the wounded Hargrove, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. "I aimed for his shoulder deliberately, Doctor. I wanted him to stand trial, not escape judgment through death." Watson knelt beside Hargrove, opening his medical bag to attend to the wound. "The shot is clean, through the muscle without hitting the artery. He'll live to face the consequences of his actions." Holmes was studying Mrs. Morwood with a mixture of admiration and concern. "How did you come to be here? You left Baker Street after we departed." A faint smile touched her lips. "My uncle's influence extends beyond the Admiralty, Mr. Holmes. When I telegraphed him of my intention to follow you, he arranged for a special train to Dover and a guide who knew these cliffs intimately." She glanced toward the top of the ravine. "The man is waiting above with horses. I arrived only minutes before you began your pursuit." From below came the sounds of Lestrade and his men securing the cove, while the beam of the Vigilance searchlight swept the shoreline, illuminating the scene of the thwarted exchange. The gears of deception had finally stopped turning, revealing the truth they had concealed for so long. As Watson bandaged Hargrove's shoulder, the naval officer looked up at Mrs. Morwood, his expression a complex mixture of bitterness and something almost like respect. "You were always stronger than Philip gave you credit for, Margaret." "Yes," she agreed simply, the pistol now lowered to her side. "That was one of many things he never had the chance to learn about me." The eastern sky had begun to lighten imperceptibly, the first hint of dawn still hours away, but the darkest part of the night now passing. As they prepared to transport the wounded traitor back to Dover and formal justice, Watson reflected that this liminal time, neither full night nor approaching day, seemed fitting for the conclusion of a case that had revolved so completely around the measurement and meaning of particular moments in time. The clockmaker's final secret had been revealed, his stopped timepieces now understood as his last message to the world, marking forever the hour when betrayal had come to claim him, just as it had claimed his friend 3 years before. The hands of all those clocks, frozen at 2:17, had been silently accusing James Hargrove all along, waiting only for the right observer to understand their testimony. 2 weeks had passed since the events at Lighthouse Cove. London had slipped deeper into autumn's embrace, the trees in the parks surrendering the last of their golden leaves, morning mists lingering until midday, and the particular quality of afternoon light that seems to render the city in sepia tones, like a photograph slowly fading into history. In the sitting room of 221p Baker Street, a cheerful fire crackled in the grate, holding the season's chill at bay, as Holmes and Watson entertained their visitors. Thomas Merrick, now officially installed as the proprietor of Edward Tiller's shop, sat near the window, his youthful face animated as he described the modifications he had made to the premises. Margaret Morwood, no longer in full mourning attire, but dressed in subdued colours that acknowledged her continuing respect for her husband's memory, occupied the chair opposite Holmes, a teacup balanced elegantly in her hand. "Business has been surprisingly brisk," Merrick was saying. "Inspector Lestrade suggested I might consider changing the shop's name, given the unfortunate associations, but I felt it important to maintain Mr. Tiller's legacy. His reputation for precision and reliability shouldn't be lost because of the manner of his death. A commendable decision, Holmes approved. Tiller's craftsmanship deserves to be remembered. I imagine his connection to such a sensational case has not harmed your commercial prospects either. Merrick coloured slightly. There has been a certain curiosity factor, he admitted, though I discourage such morbid interest. I prefer to focus customers' attention on the workmanship, not the tragedy. A wise approach, Watson commented, noting how the young man had matured in the short time since they had first encountered him. Responsibility had settled well on his shoulders, giving him a quiet confidence that complemented his technical skills. Mrs. Morwood sipped her tea before addressing Holmes. I received a letter from my uncle yesterday. The Admiralty's internal investigation is complete.